Tractate Sanhedrin discusses the laws of the court and capital punishment. As a preface, there are three types of courts. There is a typical court, a court presided over by 3 judges, which can judge most forms of monetary law, and this is the only form of court that still exists today. As the other 2 courts are the Sanhedrin, which can only exist so long as the temple in Jerusalem does. The second court is the Lesser Sanhedrin, with 23 judges, which can judge capital punishment. And the third court is the Great Sanhedrin, which proceeded in the actual temple and was comprised of 71 judges. And they made the final decisions on any laws and could make judgments on things like false prophets or idolatrous cities. There are particular qualifications required to be a judge or a witness within a court, and there are various forms of court-administered punishments. There's monetary penalties, lashes, death penalties, with 4 variants which will be discussed, and excommunication. Most of these no longer apply, particularly lashes and the death penalty, as those can only be administered through the Sanhedrin, which can only exist if the temple does, meaning a few thousand years ago when the temple stood, or when Moshiach comes and the temple is rebuilt. Chapter 1 will begin by discussing the laws of different types of courts. The first Mishnah says, the following types of cases can be tried by a court of 3 judges. Monetary cases, robbery, physical injury, property damages, half damages, and 2 times, 4 times, and 5 times compensation after theft. Cases involving a violator or seducer are judged by a court of 3. Rabbi Meir said the case of a defamer, a husband claiming his wife committed adultery, is judged by a court of 3, while the sages said by a lesser Sanhedrin of 23, as it could technically result in capital punishment. It's debated if cases involving lashes are judged by a court of 3 or 23. The calculation of a new month from the moon is done before a court of 3, as is the calculation of the leap year, according to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says the leap year is initially judged by 3, and then it's discussed with 5, and then finalized with 7, although it's still valid if finalized with 3. The leaning on the offering by the judges, and also the decapitation of a calf as atonement for an unsolved murder, are debated if they're judged by 3 or 5. The chalitza and miyun ceremony to reject a marriage are judged by 3. The appraisal of 4th-year fruits and ma'aser sheni tithes with unknown values are judged by 3. Consecrated items are appraised by a court of 3. Erech, consecration valuations, which will be discussed in later tractates. If it's with a movable object, it's appraised by a court of 3, and some say one of those must be by a Kohen. And the appraisal of consecrated land and people's value are done before 9 men and a Kohen. As for things judged by a lesser Sanhedrin, that would include capital punishment, cases of bestiality, the stoning of an ox if it kills somebody, those are judged by a court of 23. If the person was killed by a wild animal, a wolf, lion, bear, leopard, snake, or otherwise, some say anybody can just kill the animal, others say it has to be specifically judged before a court of 23. There are various things judged by the Great Sanhedrin in the temple, a court of 71. The judgment of a tribe, a false prophet, and a Kohen Gadol. Their permission is required to go into a discretionary war. Their permission is required to make addition to the court of Jerusalem or the temple courtyard. Lesser Sanhedrins for the tribes are appointed by them. A town can be designated as idolatrous only by them. Such a town cannot be designated if it's on the border of Israel and another country, and you can only designate 2 of them. As mentioned, the Great Sanhedrin was comprised of 71 judges, the Lesser Sanhedrin was comprised of 23, and we bring verses as source. Some say the Greater Sanhedrin was comprised of 70. Some say a city must have 120 people within to have a Sanhedrin, others say 230. The Gemara asks, why does it list monetary cases and then theft and bodily injury cases separately? So it explains that those are in fact actually monetary cases, they're just listed separately to exclude cases of admissions and loans from this, meaning that unlike by those, ordained judges aren't required to encourage people to lend money. Others say technically it's that only 1 judge is required, but there was a concern that he could be somebody not knowledgeable, so they instituted it to be 3. There's a practical difference if 2 judges judge a loan dispute, if that's allowed or not. Cases of damages are listed separately from monetary disputes because it also stated half damages separately, which have the payment of compensation not be in accordance with the principle. It lists the scriptural sources that a court has 3 judges, the wording of which is debated. Some actually say they're judged by 5, with the majority being 3, although that's debated from verses. It also argues on the legitimacy of particular exposition from these verses to determine the proper amount of judges required. This is debated from a variety of other sources. It also debates the legitimacy in regards to authorizing a single judge for monetary cases. Some say it's valid if you're learned, even if you don't have authorization. It said you should still get authorization from the house of the Reish Galusa, the head of the Jewish people during a time of exile. It's said that authorization to judge can be granted in Babylon or Israel, or from Babylon to Israel, but it debates if it's legitimate to do from Israel to Babylon. It says it's not based on a particular incident, and it argues this further. There was a specific time a sage was denied authorization to judge cases of firstborn animal blemishes. It asks why. It says he had studied for many years, so he was such an expert that he might allow blemishes that people weren't familiar with, and then other people would start mixing up the law. It also explains the necessity to authorize judges for these matters, as it cites incidents of unauthorized individuals giving incorrect rulings on laws of impurity and similar. It's also said that a partial authorization is effective, as is a conditional authorization. In regards to the opinion that it's sufficient for only 2 judges to judge a lone dispute, the court is still called insolent if this occurs, and the validity of this is debated. Regarding errors in judgment, it said if somebody contradicted something directly stated in a Mishnah, so liability for misjudgment must be where he ruled incorrectly between 2 disputing opinions, where the law was unresolved. It's debated how many judges are required for a legal compromise. Some say 3 are necessary, some say 1 is sufficient. The reason why is discussed. It said that a compromise requires an act of acquisition, even if judged by a court of 3. There are many related verses on compromise discussed. Some say once a verdict has been reached, the judge can no longer make a compromise, which is specifically once the judge has said if somebody's liable or not. It's held that it's a very meritorious thing for a judge to rule a compromise. Some say it means it's even a meritorious thing to offer a compromise. Related, it said that Aaron's decision to make the golden calf was a compromise, as seen in the verses that Hur, his nephew, tried to stop them, and they killed him. So he said instead of them killing him, it would be better to try and install and make the golden calf, which could be repented for. There are many related verses expounded on. It also says that a true judgment causes the divine presence to rest on Israel, and if a judge incorrectly takes a litigant's money, God will take the judge's soul. There are further points on the great importance of judging carefully and accurately, and to share responsibility between several judges. There are various other verses on the importance of not appointing an unqualified judge, on not judging incorrectly, and similar. This goes further. It's also said a zimun is done before 3. A zimun typically refers to a portion of the blessings after a meal. Here, it refers to summoning a defendant to be judged, where the summoner must make the declaration in the name of all 3 judges if it's not the day of judgment. If it is, this isn't necessary. In regards to judgments of penalties, 3 are required, and it can't be a single ordained judge. The debate as to whether a defamer requires a court of 3 or 23 is based on if we're concerned about gossip, which would cause witnesses to possibly come up, which could then turn the case into one of capital punishment. Others say the debate between them is in a case where the husband said he had witnesses, meaning it was brought before a court of 23, and then he said he didn't have witnesses, so it's argued as to whether we maintain the court of 23 out of respect, or we just disband it down to a court of 3. This is debated from other sources. Another explanation of the debate, there were witnesses, and they generally warned the wife, and it is debated if the capital case can be tried with 23 based on a general warning, or it can't, as a specific warning would be required. Others say the debate is where the woman was learned, and the debate is whether capital punishment can be given to an unwarned learned person. Others say is that she was warned by witnesses for lashes, and there's debate as to whether a court of 23 or 3 are required to administer lashes. Others say the case is where one of the witnesses to the wife's infidelity was found to be ineligible or a relative, and there's a different debate as to whether this completely invalidates the group's testimony. Another 7th explanation of the debate as to whether 23 or 3 judges are required to judge the case of a husband who accuses his wife of adultery. It could be that the woman was warned and then a separate pair of witnesses testified against her. It's debated if this is valid to make it a capital case. Another explanation of the debate is a case where the witnesses gave slightly contradicting testimony on very small, trivial details, so it's debated if that's enough to make it no longer a capital case or otherwise. Related, as false witnesses are punished with the punishment they tried to give to the defendant, false witnesses on a defamer don't give a monetary payment, even though the woman would have lost her marriage contract, as they're going to receive the death penalty anyways. If the husband brought witnesses to disprove the witnesses who testified falsely about the illegitimacy of his first witnesses, the false witnesses are put to death and also pay a fine, as it was to 2 separate parties. Another point on witnesses, if a man was violated by another man, he can testify alongside a single other witness, if he hadn't consented. If he had consented, some say he cannot testify as he's a sinner now, who cannot testify. Others say it's just that a person is considered to be related to themselves, so he can't establish himself as a sinner. There are many related points on such witness testimonies and on reciprocal punishments by false witnesses. It gives the scriptural source that cases of lashes are judged by 3, which are discussed. Others say it's 23, and they debate sources. Some include the actual sanctification of the new moon along with the calculation of the month as done before a quarter 3. One opinion said the leap year calculation is done with 3, 5, and then 7, with majority rulings between every individual court. It brings sources for the concept of these 3 individual courts, and there are a few related incidents mentioned on the topic of not embarrassing people. One teacher on the study hall requested that whoever had eaten garlic should leave, so one of the sages left so as to not embarrass the student, and also there was a time where a woman entered the study hall and said that one of the students had betrothed her through cohabitation, so the teacher gave her a bill of divorce, and then every student in the school gave her one also, so that way the student that betrothed her wouldn't be embarrassed. There are related verses cited and additional qualifications on the extensions of a year to a leap year. The Nasi needs to agree, and it could be done to have time to repair the roads or the ovens or otherwise. There are various other reasons listed for the institution of a leap year. The court convened to establish a leap year in Judea, and it debated if it was allowed in Galilee based on verses. It said that the leap year calculation is only done by day, and it brings sources. There are other principles when in the year the calculation is made, and it debates on other reasons for the extension of the year, such as if it's allowed to be done if everybody would be impure and wouldn't be able to bring the paschal offering. This is debated based on several particular incidents. If the addition is made on the 30th day of Adar, some say it's invalid, as that day can also be the 1st of Nisan, and the added month is a 2nd Adar in between the 1st Adar and Nisan. Some say it is valid, it's debated. There's also an argument as to the dates for the leap year, with or without intercalation, and they argue sources based on particular dates within summer's length and similar. These points are discussed further. In regards to the leaning on the offering by 3 judges, the word used is smicha, which typically refers to the ordination of somebody as a rabbi, which is called smicha. Here, the word smicha refers specifically to the leaning on an offering. Ordination to become a rabbi is done before 3. Leaning hands is not required. The title rabbi is given, and they're allowed to adjudicate cases involving penalties. The specific process of this was a ceremony passed down from Moshe to his students and down to the times of the Romans. And at that point, rabbinical ordination was outlawed, and the line that was passed down from Moshe until that generation was in danger of being ended. So the sage Yehuda ben Bava went between 2 mountains and ordained 5 other prominent sages, and the Roman soldiers discovered this, so he told them to run off, and he was stabbed to death with 300 iron spears. However, it does say that, unmentioned, there were 2 other men with Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, so ordination actually must be done with 3 rabbis. Some say it also must be done within Israel. It cites other instances on the ordination of various other sages. The decapitation of a calf as atonement must be done before a quarter 3, and it gives scriptural sources for this. It's debated as to who need to be present alongside the court during the measuring of the distance of the corpse in such a situation, along with disagreement regarding the amount of judges required for the appraisal of consecrated objects. Some say 3, some say 10. It debates the meaning of erech, consecration valuations for movable property. Some say it means giving the valuation of the utensil. In regards to monetary value, some say it's a pledge of specific movable objects to fulfill an erech vow. Others say it's appraisal of objects taken for failure to pay his erech valuation. These are debated. It's said that appraisal of consecrated land and people, at least their value, is done with 9 men and a Kohen, and it gives sources. It debates particular forms of appraisal, such as by hair that's about to be cut, whether that requires 3 or 10 people, and similar. We also said that capital punishment cases are judged by a court of 23, as are cases of bestiality, either way applying if the animal is with a man or a woman. It gives sources, and it also discusses verses for the execution of an animal that killed somebody. It also says an animal that had impermissibly approached Mount Sinai would similarly be judged before a court of 23. Regarding the various wild animals, lions, snakes, leopards, and similar, some say they have the status of animals that could be tamed, so they can only be killed if they kill a person. Others say they cannot, so they could be killed on sight. They debate this further. In regards to the judgment of a whole tribe by a court of 23, it debates what violation it's discussing. It's said that if it was idolatry, they're judged as individuals, meaning via stoning. But they still are judged by the full court of 71. A false prophet and Kohen Gadol are judged by a full court of 71, and it gives scriptural sources along with the source that a discretionary war is only declared through the Great Sanhedrin's approval, along with the sequence of King David making such a declaration when it occurred. There are various verses on this discussed, along with the sources that the Greater Sanhedrin alone can appoint a Lesser Sanhedrin, along with their given locations. The remaining points are qualified. It gives sources from Scripture as to the original composition of the Sanhedrin, with 70 judges and Moshe leading them, and how the judges were drawn with lots and similar. Two of the men, Eldad and Medad, refused to participate out of humility and were rewarded with prophecy. Some say that they foretold Moshe's passing, others say Yehoshua's crossing into Israel, others say the incident with the birds, others say of Moshiach's coming and Gog and Magog. Sources are discussed. There are particular points which will be discussed further on later. It said that members of the Sanhedrin must be men of height, wisdom, imposing appearance, old age, acquainted with witchcraft to be able to prosecute it, and who know the 70 languages, so that way they won't need an interpreter. Some say they also must be knowledgeable enough to know how to purify a sheret creature according to biblical law. There are points on the requirements to know every language, and also throughout the whole Gemara, it often uses expressions to refer to various sages without using their actual given names, so it gives a complete list of the terminologies and who they refer to here. Regarding the mentioned requirement for a city to have a minimum of 120 men to have a Sanhedrin, this is 23 for the court, and then 3 rows of 23 scholars, and then 10 unoccupied men who stay in the synagogue, and then also a stenographer, court officers, 2 litigants, 2 witnesses, 2 to discredit the witnesses, and 2 to discredit those, and then 6 others for various town positions, a doctor, scribe, butcher, charity collector, and otherwise. Others say the required amount was 230, others say 277, others said 278. Within Scripture, it does a calculation and says the total number of judges were 78,600. And that's the end of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Tractate Sanhedrin lists various other laws of the court, here in regards to the Kohen Gadol and kings. The first Mishnah says, a Kohen Gadol can judge or be judged, and can testify and be testified against. A Kohen Gadol can do chalitza, the rejection of the levirate marriage, and chalitza can be done with his wife, as can yibum, the levirate marriage, although the Kohen Gadol cannot do yibum, as he cannot marry a widow. Rabbi Meir says, if a Kohen Gadol's relative passes, he cannot follow right behind the bier. He can only appear when they're out of his sight, and he can only go as far as the entrance gates of his city. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and says the Kohen Gadol cannot even leave the temple to follow a bier. When the Kohen Gadol comforts mourners and the line of people pass by them, the Kohen Gadol walks alongside them with the assistant Kohen Gadol alongside him. When the Kohen Gadol is being comforted, people tell him, "We are your atonement," and he responds, "May you be blessed from heaven." And when he's fed the mourner's meal, everybody sits on the ground and he reclines on a bench. A king cannot judge or be judged, or testify or be testified against. He cannot do chalitza or yibum, and chalitza or yibum cannot be done with his wife. It's actually a dispute whether a king should do yibum or chalitza. You cannot marry a king's widow. Others say a king can marry a king's widow, as King David married King Saul's widow. The Gemara says, it mentioned the Kohen Gadol can judge and be judged, just as it said the same formatting by a king. Some say it specifically mentions the Kohen Gadol can be judged, to say that if a Kohen Gadol kills somebody accidentally, he's exiled. It additionally clarifies that in non-capital cases, just like everybody else, a Kohen Gadol is judged before a court of 3. In regard to the Kohen Gadol testifying, this means he testifies before a king, as befits his honor. It's also said that a king cannot be a part of the Sanhedrin, as the other judges wouldn't be able to dispute him then, and the king and Kohen Gadol cannot participate in the extension to a leap year, as a king might want to save wages for his army, and the Kohen Gadol might want to make it so that way Yom Kippur won't fall out when it's cold. This is discussed. It gives sources for the points on the Kohen Gadol's mourning. The laws of the kings, that they cannot judge or be judged, applies to the kings of Israel. Kings of the Davidic dynasty can. It was instituted that the kings of Israel cannot after Alexander Yanai, a heretical king, was judged, and Shimon ben Shattach reprimanded this, and it caused a lot of issues. It was also said that a king cannot do chalitza, as it's a mitzvah, and you cannot renounce your honor to do a mitzvah. It discusses points on several of King David's marriages. Related, it refers to Ruth's son as a son of Naomi, which is as Naomi raised him. It says similarly about other scriptural figures, including Moshe and Batya, who raised him, and it said, whoever teaches a boy Torah, it's as if he fathered him, which is based on some verses. There are further points on King David's marriages, and how Saul gave his daughter Michal to another man, Palti, in marriage after David, although Palti supported her but never was intimate with her. Some additional points on this topic are discussed. New Mishnah: if somebody related to a king passes, he cannot leave the entrance of the palace to follow the funeral procession. Others say he can if he wants to, as King David followed the bier of Avner, but others say that was unique as it was done to placate the people. When the king eats the mourner's meal, everybody sits on the floor and he sits on a dargash, which is a type of chair. The Gemara says a debate. Some say women should go in front or behind a funeral bier, depending on the custom, and others say they should always go in front, and they debate this based on a number of verses. It argues as to what exactly a dargash is. It's said to be a leather cot of some sort. It describes the bed a bit further. New Mishnah: a king can wage war with the consent of the Sanhedrin of 71 judges, and a king is allowed to break fences of people's property to make himself a path to his field, and people cannot protest this. A king has first choice of any spoils of war. The Gemara says it repeats the first point, now by the laws of kings. Some say a king can actually use any of these powers, others say they're just stated to make people fear the king. It's debated from a number of verses whether the Jewish people had a requirement to appoint a king. Some say it was required, some say it was only as they were complaining that they wanted one. When the Jewish people entered the land of Israel, they had 3 commandments: to appoint a king, to eradicate Amalek, and to build the temple. They didn't know the order, so it's explained it's based on scripture. Also, it lists points on King Solomon's kingship. It said that it slowly regressed from including being over the upper beings to only being over his country, to only over Jerusalem, to only his bed, and then only his staff, which is based on some verses. It's debated if King Solomon fully regained his kingship after he lost it for a period to the king of the demons, as discussed in Tractate Gittin on page 68b. New Mishnah: the verse says a king cannot take too many wives. Some say this is a limit on 18, others say he can have more so long as they don't turn him away from God. Others say he cannot even marry a single woman that'll turn him away from God, with a limit on 18. The Gemara explains the dispute to be between an interpretation on scripture. It additionally explains the source for the limit of 18 based on points on the wives of King David. It also expounds in verses regarding the incident with Amnon and Tamar. It says in the verse that Amnon hated Tamar after he violated her, as his genitalia had been cut by her hair. It says that this was as Tamar was the daughter of a convert, as a Jewish woman up until the destruction of the first temple didn't have any hair grow on their body. After the incident with Tamar, people started being a lot more careful with such things, and the laws against seclusion and cohabitation with an unmarried woman were instituted. It expounds on further verses. New Mishnah: the verse says a king shouldn't have too many horses. This means he should only have enough for his chariots. It also says he shouldn't have too much gold and silver, which is that he should only have enough to pay his soldiers. A king writes his own Torah scroll, which he takes to war and brings to judgment, and sets it opposite himself when he reclines, based on the verse. The Gemara additionally expounds on the points and sources for the limit to how many horses and coins he can have. It says King Solomon transgressed here. He also married the Pharaoh's daughter, and when he did so, it said that the angel Gabriel went and stuck a reed at the bottom of the ocean, which slowly formed into a sandbank, where Rome was built atop eventually. It explains the reason there are many commandments in the Torah which don't have explanation given, things like the laws of kosher or sha'anis, is because there are laws which, if explained, people would try to circumvent them logically, as King Solomon did. For instance, the prohibition against the king having too many wives or horses actually did have explanations given, not to have too many wives, as otherwise the king would turn from God. So King Solomon thought to cut the wives and just not turn from God, and it didn't really work out. And the prohibition against having too many horses was so that way nobody would return to the land of Egypt, which Solomon thought to get the horses without returning to the land of Egypt, and that didn't end up working out either. It's additionally said that a king should write his own Torah scroll even if he was passed down one, and some say this applies to every Jewish person, and the custom nowadays is to have a letter written on your behalf within a scroll by the scribe. It says the Torah was originally written in Hebrew, but was later also given in Aramaic for the Samaritans. It expounds various points on these different scripts. New Mishnah: only the king can ride on the king's horse, and only the king can sit on the king's throne or use the king's scepter. No one can watch the king's hair be cut, and nobody can watch him undress in the bathhouse, as the verse implies that the awe of the king must be upon you. The Gemara expounds on various verses regarding King David and Avishag, and various points on the tragedy of a man who loses his wife. It said that a person is predestined in the womb to marry somebody, but to remarry it's as difficult to arrange as the splitting of the sea. There are various other teachings on the closeness between a husband and a first wife. It said based on verses that a king cuts his hair every day, a Kohen Gadol every Friday, before the Mishmar group comes, a Kohen every 30 days, just like the standard Nazarite term. It said Kohanim can still now grow out their hair, as they'll still be able to serve in the temple immediately when Moshiach comes, as they could just cut their hair really quickly, although there would be issues with Kohanim becoming intoxicated. It also describes the Kohen Gadol's unique haircut that he would receive. And that's the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Tractate Sanhedrin begins discussing the laws of court-administered monetary litigation and testimony. The first Mishnah says, monetary cases are judged before a court of three. Rabbi Meir says each litigant picks one, and they both agree on a third. The sages say the other two judges agree on a third. Rabbi Meir says the litigants can just disqualify the other litigant's judge if they want. The sages say they need a valid reason that he's ineligible. They cannot be disqualified if they're certified experts. Rabbi Meir says each litigant can disqualify the other's witnesses, and the sages say they can bring proofs they're ineligible, but if they're eligible, they cannot be disqualified. The Gemara explains, when it says they select courts, they can both recommend a court, and if they don't agree with the others, they have to find the court they agree on. This applies to a creditor. A debtor cannot reject a court. He can be forced to use the one in his hometown. Others reinterpret this and say that each agree on a single judge and then agree on the third. It debates if the dispute as to who appoints the third judge is based on if the judges need to consent to him. Related, it said that witnesses don't sign on a document unless they know who's signing with them, and this is discussed further. In regards to the permissibility of rejecting the other's witnesses, some say this means that the litigant and a witness reject the witnesses based on a disqualifying flaw of blemished lineage. Others say the dispute is where the litigant says he has two sets of witnesses. It's debated if he needs to substantiate the claim and bring out the second set. He wouldn't be able to disqualify just a single set of witnesses. This is discussed. Others say the dispute is where the witnesses were confirmed to be ineligible, and if this means that the judges can therefore also be disqualified. And this is debated, and it brings many verses and points admiring the people of Israel and criticizing the people of Babylonia and their studies, which largely created many inconclusive rulings, like this entire text, the Babylonian Gemara. New Mishnah. If a litigant says he accepts the other's father to act as a judge, or 3 cattle herders to act as a judge, Rabbi Meir says he can retract this. The sages say he cannot. If a litigant needs to take a court-imposed oath, and the other said he could just take a personal oath, Rabbi Meir says he could retract this, and the sages say he cannot. The Gemara explains that the father would be acting as one of the judges in this case. It's debated whether it's the plaintiff or the defendant that can potentially retract this. These principles are debated further. It's said that the dispute involves retraction after the verdict is made, and we follow the opinion of the sages that retraction is not allowed. New Mishnah. A list of people ineligible to be judges or witnesses: somebody who gambles, somebody who lends with interest, pigeon flyers, and sellers of sabbatical year produce. Gamblers are allowed if they have another job besides for the fact that they gamble. The Gemara explains the issues with gambling. Essentially that it's a legal agreement where the party doesn't fully consent to giving up his money as he expected to win, so the collection of the money is technically a form of stealing. It's debated if a wager falls into this category. In addition to not lending on interest, it says that if there's somebody who borrows on interest, they would also be disqualified from testimony. It relates in particular incident. There was a time a butcher was found to be giving non-kosher meat, so he was disqualified from testimony, and it was said he could repent by moving to a place where nobody recognized him, and returning an object of large value, or by throwing out his own non-kosher meat that's worth a large sum. It also defines pigeon flyers. Some say it means betting on pigeon racing. Others say it means using pigeons to lure and steal others, and this is debated further. Some add to the list of people disqualified from testimony: robbers who take objects retrieved from mentally incompetent people, which wasn't initially mentioned as it's uncommon or as it's not technically real theft. Also included is somebody who makes a purchase without the permission of the owner, and also herders and tax collectors and others. These are all qualified. The points on produce collection and sales during the sabbatical year are discussed, along with the verses regarding Sanherib's siege against Chizkiah in Jerusalem, expounding on the meaning behind many verses. These are discussed further, and it rules that gamblers are only forbidden to be witnesses if that's their only profession. Some say all these listed disqualified individuals must have their disqualification proclaimed in court. Others say it's everybody besides for a herder. Some say if somebody publicly receives charity from individuals who worship idols, he cannot be a witness. They also say somebody suspected of forbidden relations can give testimony, but is disqualified to testify on the marital status of a woman, or possibly to testify to release a woman from marriage. It's also said that a sharecropper who takes an extra small amount and from not fully grown produce is not legally regarded as a thief and disqualified from testimony. It's debated if digging a grave on the first day of a holiday disqualifies somebody from giving testimony. It's also debated and held that somebody who testified and was then retroactively found to be disqualified from testimony, his testimony is retroactively disqualified. It cites other similar such disputes, and these are discussed further. New Mishnah. The relatives that are forbidden to testify for somebody are somebody's brother, father, or mother's brother, sister's husband, father's sister's husband, mother's sister's husband, mother's husband, father-in-law, wife's sister's husband, along with their sons and son-in-laws. Other add the stepson, but not the stepson's own son or son-in-law. Some said it goes by people who inherit from him. Some say If he was related to the person and becomes unrelated prior to witnessing their testimony, they can testify. Others say if somebody's daughter passed, but his son-in-law has children from her, he's his relative. One's close friend, a groomsman, and one's enemy, somebody he didn't speak to for 3 days due to a fight, are not allowed to testify on him. Others say that Jewish people are not suspected to bear false witness to their friends or enemies. The Gemara gives scriptural source for these points. It gives sources for many of the particularly forbidden relatives. It said a father's brother cannot testify on somebody, including his son and son-in-law, both ways. It debates this, as this is a third-level relative testifying against a first-level relative. It argues on this in cites of sources. Specifically, a mother's husband's son refers to a brother's brother, being a stepbrother. Some say a person can testify about his wife during the first stage of marriage, but only to take money from her, not to obtain for her. This is rejected based on sources. The remaining points are qualified, and it debates who we hold like. In regards to the friend or a groomsman, some say he cannot testify all 7 days of celebration after the wedding. Others say from the first day. It gives sources for the points on an enemy. New Mishnah. A witness is examined by bringing them into a courtroom where they're intimidated, so that way they won't falsely testify. Everybody is sent out besides for the most prominent witness, and they question him, and he must specify exactly what happened. Then the second witness is brought in, and they see if his testimony corresponds. The judges then deliberate, and the ruling goes by majority, 2 out of 3. If 2 judges are split and the other judge cannot decide, they add judges. After they do decide, litigants are brought in, and they announce if the person is guilty or not. Based on a verse, we know the individual judges should not say what they had personally ruled. The Gemara explains, the witnesses are intimidated by citing verses on the importance of being an honest witness. The points on the witness's testimony are qualified, and it discusses the verses on Adam and Eve and the tree of knowledge, and how it shows the importance of never adding to God's words. As Adam said to not eat or touch from the tree, so when the serpent convinced Eve to just touch of the tree, which itself wasn't problematic, she then ate of it too. It cites particular incidents showing the requirement that witnesses be designated where hidden witnesses were not permitted and similar. It also discusses times when witnesses can record an admission and whether an act of acquisition was required. Some say the judges are required to write on the verdict that it wasn't unanimous. Others disagree. The dispute is based on whether the prohibition against saying gossip or against lying would apply here. It's a rule that they just write that the court was split, but they don't specify by which judges. The remaining steps are additionally qualified. It debates the particular opinions based on particular incidents, along with what constitutes a problematic discrepancy between testimonies. It said that discrepancies regarding supplementary details by monetary law, like them saying the loan was comprised of old or new coins, is an example of this. It is debated if such a discrepancy would invalidate a case of capital punishment. Others debate these statements, and it cites a few particular incidents of these laws. New Mishnah. After a verdict is issued, if a litigant brings further evidence, the verdict can then be nullified. If the court gave him a deadline to produce evidence, he must produce the evidence within that time frame. Others disagree and say it can still be presented after. It's also debated if during the trial, the litigant says he has no witnesses or evidence and only finds them afterwards, whether this is valid or not. It is agreed that during the trial, where he said he has no witnesses or evidence, it's invalid if he tries to bring out evidence right before he's found guilty. The Gemara says, we follow the opinion that the evidence can be brought after the court's time limit. It said we follow the opinion that additional evidence cannot be brought after the trial ends if he said he had none. It cites an incident where this was accepted, as the case was with a child who was not knowledgeable about the existence of the witnesses. It mentions some related incidents. There are further points. It's ruled that we can force the case to be at the place of assembly if it's the debtor saying he wants to have the case there, and it brings an incident of this. And that's the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Tractate Sanhedrin continues discussing the laws of the court, now on some initial points on capital trials. The first Mishnah says, monetary cases and capital cases are both subject to having their witnesses undergo inquiry and questioning. The differences between them are that monetary cases are judged by a court of 3, while capital punishment cases are judged with a court of 23. Monetary cases open with statements of liability or non-liability, while capital cases open with statements for acquittal alone. Monetary cases are decided by majority. Capital cases can have a majority of 1 for acquittal and require a majority of 2 for conviction. Monetary cases can be reversed to liability or non-liability. Capital cases can only be reversed for acquittal. Monetary cases, anybody can argue for liability or non-liability. Capital cases, everybody can argue for acquittal, but not necessarily for conviction. In monetary cases, somebody can switch their argument from liability to non-liability and vice versa. Like capital cases, a person can only switch his argument towards acquittal. Monetary cases are tried by day and can conclude at night. Capital cases are tried by day and conclude by day. Monetary cases can conclude on the day they begin, either way. Capital cases can conclude on the first day for acquittal, but only on later days for conviction, which is why the trials aren't held on the day before Shabbos or holidays. For monetary cases and also cases of purity and impurity, the most eminent judge begins. By capital cases, it begins with the least eminent. Anybody is eligible to judge a monetary case, while only Kohanim, Leviim, and Yisraelim who are eligible to marry their daughters to Kohanim, meaning they have proper ancestry, can judge capital cases. The Gemara explains the necessity for inquiry and questioning of witnesses by monetary cases, as it's possible the document in this situation was misdated. There's contradictory sources and discussed. It said that capital cases open with statements encouraging acquittal. It gives some potential instances of this, asking the accused if he has witnesses to contradict the accusing witness, telling him not to be concerned if he isn't guilty, beginning by announcing that if anybody has testimony to his acquittal, they should bring it now, and similar. We said monetary cases can be reversed either way. This is specifically by an expert judge, unlike by a different contradicting source. Others say the difference is that here, it's allowed if the contradiction was against something clearly stated in a Mishnah as opposed to ruling incorrectly by a debated topic. This is argued on. Some say the difference is here, you can reverse it as he hadn't actually taken money from one and given it to the other, unlike by the other instance where he had done so. This is discussed. And it also gives the scriptural source that capital cases of acquittal cannot be reversed. It said that conviction for exile, if acquitted, cannot be reversed, and lashes also can only be reversed to acquittal. It said an error in judgment for acquittal by a case of adultery can be reversed, and if it was with an unnatural form of adultery, which isn't specifically mentioned in the Torah, it cannot be reversed to conviction. When it said that anybody can advance an argument for acquittal by capital punishment, that referred to the students of the judges. It brings sources for this. These points are debated further. It also brings sources for the times of trial, that monetary cases are done by day and can conclude by night, while capital cases must conclude by day. Based on this, some allow a blind man to judge monetary cases. These points are additionally discussed based on some verses. Further sources are cited for all these principles, and it also brings proofs that the obligations for execution within capital punishment, where necessary, do not override the Shabbos laws. Based on this, it debates that capital punishment overrides various sacrificial services. In regards to the order of judges, starting with the most eminent, it says, from the days of Moshe until Rebbe, we don't find great Torah knowledge and authority in one person at a time, and it debates this from various different scriptural figures and famous sages. It gives the source that capital cases are judged starting from the least eminent, and it says that a person can teach a student laws of capital judgment and then judge alongside him. The laws of a capital case do not apply to the judgment of an ox that killed a person, besides the fact that it's judged before 23. When we said all could judge a monetary case, this includes even an illegitimate individual. It gives the sources that a court for capital punishment cannot have genealogical blemishes. New Mishnah. Sanhedrin was shaped in a semicircle. 2 stenographers would stand on the right and on the left, one for the conviction and one for the acquittal. Others say there was a 3rd stenographer to record both. 3 rows of students would sit in front, in order of eminence. If one of them was to be ordained, they would take one of the most eminent of the students and would seat a new student in accordance with his level. The Gemara gives the scriptural source that the Sanhedrin was shaped like a semicircle, and cites some verses and expounds on points that even very poor quality individuals have redeeming features. There was a sage, Rav Zera, who tried to befriend some troublemakers in his town to try and have them repent, and they always ignored and mocked him, but then the sage passed away, so they then said that who will pray for mercy on our behalf, and they all repented. It says when a new student is added to replace the judge, everybody must shift to their new position, and if somebody complains that he's now at the end of a row, it's as it said, it's better to be the tail to a lion than the head of a fox. New Mishnah. When a capital case is tried, the witnesses are brought in and admonished, saying, perhaps you think to testify falsely, but this is unlike a monetary case, where at worst there's monetary repayment. Here, you'll be responsible for the death of this man and all of his future descendants. This is, as it says, man was created singly, to teach that whoever ends a life is as if he ended an entire world. And if somebody saves a life, it's as if he saves an entire world. Also, man was created singly, so that way nobody can say that they had greater ancestry, and so nobody could say there were multiple creators making multiple people. And also to show the greatness of God, that he created all people from a single mold, and none are alike. This is why everybody must say that for my sake the world was created. It then lists further verses the witnesses are warned with. The Gemara says a witness cannot even base his testimony on conjecture. It said that the sage Shimon ben Shattach once saw a man enter a ruin and then left holding a bloody knife, and there was a body on the floor, but he didn't testify against the man, as it wasn't sufficient, so he prayed that God should judge him instead, and a snake bit the man and he died. Related, it said that even though the Sanhedrin ceased and capital punishment is no longer performed, capital punishment is still done by God. So if somebody deserves stoning, it said a roof will fall on them, or they'll be trampled by animals. If somebody deserves burning, he'll either fall into a fire or be bitten by a snake. If somebody deserved beheading, he'll either be arrested or killed by bandits. And if somebody deserves strangulation, he'll either drown or choke. The man in this story had murdered, and the punishment for that is actually beheading, but he was bitten by a snake as he had committed a different sin also. It's debated if monetary cases can be based on conjecture. It said that Cain seriously mutilated Hevel with multiple cuts and bruises before cutting his throat, as nobody had killed anybody before. After the earth swallowed this blood, it says it never opened its mouth for good again. It lists verses showing the atonement of exile. A related point, it said that the sons of a sage were given wine, and it said that Moshiach will only come when the families of the Reish Kolosa and the Nasi, the prince, cease. It explains many additional verses, and it explains further reasons why man was created singly and looking different than others. It also says that man was created last on Friday, so that way heretics won't say man was a partner in creation, and also so that way man will be humble, knowing that even the lowly gnat was created before him. Also so he could celebrate Shabbos right away, and also so the world would be prepared fully for him, like guests being invited to a prepared banquet. It expounds on some further verses. It said in the first hour Adam's dust was gathered, in the second it was made into a shapeless mass, in the third his body was formed, in the fourth hour his soul was blown in, on the fifth he stood, on the sixth hour he named the animals, on the seventh hour Eve was formed, on the eighth he procreated with Eve, on the ninth he was commanded not to eat of the tree of knowledge, on the 10th he ate from the tree of knowledge, on the 11th he was judged, and on the 12th hour he was banished. It's also said an animal only attacks a person if he appears like an animal. Another teaching, when God spoke to the angels about making man, the angels asked, "What will man do?" And God told them what they would eventually do. So they tried to discourage him, so God consumed them and asked other angels. And eventually, after the flood and the diaspora of the world, the angels said, the first angels were right. And God said that he'll continue to tolerate man despite their issues based on a verse. It's also said Adam was also initially created stretching across the entire universe, the distance from the earth to the heavens, and was shrunk once he sinned. Some say Adam spoke Aramaic, as one of the words in a verse translates to Aramaic. It's also said that God showed Adam every generation in its stages, and he mourns the execution of Rabbi Akiva. Some even say Adam did idolatry. It said, whenever there's a questionable verse that idol worshippers or heretics try to misinterpret, the response is always in a nearby verse. For instance, it says, "Let us make man in our image," which is plural. So it says in the next verse that God created man in his image. It gives many more of such examples. It's also said that the plural is as God always consults the heavenly court. It gives other instances of questions on verses and the answers. There are several of these questions from heretics. One argued that God was a thief to steal Adam's side to make Eve, but his own daughter argued, saying it was more beneficial to him and was done without him seeing, as otherwise he would have been disgusted seeing it being made. Another heretic told the sage Rabban Gamliel that he knew what God was doing and where he was sitting, so the sage responded by asking what his son was doing in a different city, as he missed him, and the heretic said he couldn't tell him. So he asked, then how could you possibly know what God's doing? There are other such instances. One heretic said he knew the number of stars, so Rabban Gamliel asked him how many teeth he had. So the man started counting, and Rabban Gamliel said, if you don't know how many teeth you have without checking, how could you possibly know the number of stars? There are more of these. One sorcerer said that the top half of a body belongs to the demon Hormuz, and the lower half belongs to Ahormuz. So a sage responded by asking, then how do they allow digested food to be excreted into the other's domain? Another incident, the Caesar once asked a sage that everybody should just join together to become one nation. So he said, we're all circumcised, and you can't really undo that, so for that to be viable, you'll have to do that all to yourselves too. So the Caesar said, fair, however, you bested me in an argument, so now you get thrown to the wild beasts. But the sage wasn't eaten. A Sadducee heretic suggested that maybe they weren't hungry, so he was thrown in and he was eaten. And it gives a whole bunch more of such arguments, and it expounds on a number of verses. And that's the end of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Tractate Sanhedrin continues discussing the laws of capital punishment. The first Mishnah continues, listing the process of questioning a witness by a capital case. The witness is asked which sabbatical year cycle he saw the crime occur, which year, which month, which day of the month and week, which hour, and which location. Others say he was just asked the day, hour, and location. By a murder case, the witness is asked if he recognized the victim and if he warned the accused. By an idolatry case, he's asked which idol and how it was worshipped. The more extra questions, the better. There's main standard questions, which if answered that the witness doesn't know, his testimony is then null, and then there's supplementary questions, which they can say they don't know. If the standard and supplementary questions contradict, then the testimony is null. If one witness says the crime occurred on the 2nd of a month and the others say it was on the 3rd of the month, then that would still be valid, as we can assume that one of them didn't know it was a leap month. This does not apply if the gap was larger than a day. It can have a differentiation of a single hour. Some say it's still allowed if one says it was in the 3rd hour and the other says it was in the 5th, but not if the testimony is that it was at the 5th hour and the 7th hour, as that's the difference between the sun being in the east and the west. Afterwards, the second witness is questioned. The judges then debate. The witnesses can no longer make arguments for acquittal, and the judge's students can no longer argue for a conviction. The students can argue at any point for acquittal, as can the accused man. If they decide to acquit the man, then that's done. If they do not, they wait until the next day, and they limit their food and drink no wine, and they debate all night. Everybody states their positions, and people can change their arguments to acquittal only. If anybody made a mistake, the stenographers correct them. If he's acquitted, it's done. If not, they vote. If it's 12 to 11 for acquittal, he's acquitted. If it's 12 for conviction, or 11 to 11 and one just doesn't know, or even if 22 agree and one says he just doesn't know, they add judges by 2 until they reach 71, at which point if 36 vote acquittal, he's acquitted. If 36 vote conviction, they just debate until they reach a majority of 2. The Gemara cites sources for these points. It further explains the sources and requirements of questioning witnesses for all the forms of capital punishment. The other opinion is discussed, and it gives scriptural source that offenders need a prior warning if they're going to be punished. It lists many sources for this and explains their necessity. The remaining points are additionally qualified, and it further explains the difference between standard and supplementary questions and particularities in regards to discrepancies involving certain dates. It cites points on the importance of saying the blessing on the new moon, along with the wording of the blessing, which is this. The remaining points are discussed. It says if they reach a court of 71 and they still are stuck in a deadlock, then they should just acquit the man. It brings sources that the most eminent judge makes the court pronouncements, and that's the end of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Tractate Sanhedrin gives some additional laws on capital punishment. The first Mishnah says, once a verdict has been reached and a defendant has been pronounced guilty, he was taken out to be stoned. This was done outside of the courthouse. One man stands near the courthouse doors with a flag, and another sits on a horse within his sight, a while away. If somebody says they have grounds for acquittal, the man will wave the flags, and the man on the horse rushes to stop the execution. Even if the condemned man himself says he has grounds for acquittal, they pause the execution, and he's returned to the courthouse as many times as he wants, so long as his arguments have some validity. The Gemara says, the stoning place was actually all the way outside the city. What it's teaching is that if the court was held outside of the city, the stoning would still be done a while away, either so that way the court doesn't look like murderers, or to give time for the condemned man to hopefully be acquitted. It gives scriptural source for these laws, and it discusses the sources a bit further. The stoning stones, beheading sword, strangling cloth, and the hanging beam are all purchased from public funds, as a person shouldn't need to pay for the means of his own execution. It's debated who pays for the acquittal flag on the horse. It asks, what if somebody runs over and says he has grounds to acquit the man, but is suddenly struck mute? Does this have any validity to cause a retrial? It's debated. In regards to the condemned man himself, he can announce he has grounds for his own acquittal and be brought back to the courthouse, but specifically by the 3rd time that he needs a valid, substantive argument. A pair of Torah scholars accompany him to see if his argument is valid. The first few times we let him say whatever he wants because he'll be afraid and it's doubtful he'll say anything coherent. New Mishnah. If they found a reason to acquit the man, they would do so. If not, then he would be then executed. It would be announced his name, the son of his name is being stoned, as he transgressed such and such a prohibition, and the names of his witnesses. Whoever has grounds for acquittal should now speak. The Gemara says, they also say the time and place of the transgression to allow people to possibly discredit the witnesses. Now, this says that they ask people to bring acquittal as he's being executed. However, the recording of the execution of Yeshu HaNitzri contradicts this. Side point, as has been mentioned before, Yeshu HaNitzri is a figure mentioned a few other times throughout the Gemara. In some sources, he's translated as Jesus of Nazareth, although this is generally considered to be an inaccurate translation, as A, Yeshu does not translate to Jesus, as explained more in other sources, mainly at the end of Tractate Sota and Tractate Gittin 57a, and B, here and also in Tractate Sota, it lists the actual story of this Yeshu character, and it has little to do with the historical Jesus figure. The main discrepancy being the timing, Yeshu being objectively stated to live in about 150 BCE, which was a little while prior. Anyways, it says this Yeshu figure, after being excommunicated by his teacher, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Parachia, began practicing idolatry, sorcery, and encouraging others to do so. So they announced for 40 days beforehand, begging people to bring evidence that would acquit him for idolatry. but eventually he was executed via stoning and hung, as was always the custom after stoning, on Passover Eve. They tried very hard to acquit him, as Yeshu was very close with the government and they didn't want any issues. It said that Yeshu had 5 students named Matai, Nakai, Netzer, Buni, and Toda, and they were all also given capital punishment based on verses which reference their names. It brings additional points on the importance of repentance and its great virtue. New Mishnah. When the condemned individual was 10 cubits away from the stoning place, they would tell him to confess, as he'd have a share in the world to come, and it brings a scriptural source for this concept. If he's not sure how to confess, he's told to say, "Let my death be an atonement for all my sins." If he knows he's innocent, he says, "Let my death be an atonement for all my sins, except for this sin." Others say, then everybody would just say that. The Gemara expounds a bit more on the verses regarding the scriptural sources. It further speaks on these verses, particularly expounding on the point on Achan's execution by Yeshua after the violation of the ban on Jericho's spoils and similar. This goes further and it qualifies the remaining points. New Mishnah. Once the condemned man was 4 cubits away from the stoning grounds, he would have his clothes removed. A man would have his front covered, and a woman would have her front and back covered. Others say that a man is stoned unclothed and a woman was stoned clothed. The Gemara explains the dispute on the clothing while stoned is based on some verses. This is all unlike the Sota ceremony, where women aren't exposed at all, as she's not being executed by the Sota ceremony, so people might have improper feelings about her and try to be with her afterwards. The debate as to whether she's unclothed is on whether a person worries more about their body than degradation. New Mishnah. On the actual process of stoning, it was an elevated section twice the height of a man, and he's pushed off by 1 witness. If he dies, great. If not, he's positioned onto his side, and the second witness drops a large stone on him, killing him. If he's still alive, then everybody takes stones and stones him, as the verse says. The Gemara says it's this specific height, so it'll be a fast and painless death, and not even higher, so that way his body won't be destroyed, which would add to his indignity. It said sources. Regarding the big singular stone, it was lifted by several and thrown down hard to definitely get the guy. Additionally, it states, historically, throughout every stoning execution ever, it never actually got past this stage, so there was never actually a public stoning with rocks. That's just theoretical. It also says the execution instruments were buried within 4 cubits of his body. Also, if the witness's hands were severed, the condemned man is automatically exempted, as the verse says the hands of the witness must execute. Others debate this concept as to whether the execution needs to be precisely as the verses dictate. New Mishnah. Everybody executed by stoning are hung. Others say it's only the blasphemer and idolater that are hung. Men are hung facing the people, women are hung facing the gallows. Others say only a man is hung, and women aren't hung at all. There was a time that the sage Shimon ben Shattach hung 80 women who were practicing witchcraft on one day, but that was clearly an exception, as typically 2 cases of capital punishment cannot be judged on the same day. The Gemara explains the dispute as to who is hung is based on methods of scriptural exegesis. Sources are cited for the remaining points in regards to judging multiple capital cases on the same day. It says it's uniquely allowed if it's the same method of execution and the same transgression that can be prosecuted. And there are some related points on this. New Mishnah. The body is hung from a vertical beam with a horizontal beam at the top by his hands, which are tied together. Others say the post is leaned diagonally against a wall that he's hung from. He's hung for a very brief period, removed, and then buried immediately. It's a transgression to leave the body hanging overnight, as people will ask why he was hung, and they will have to be told that he blasphemed, for instance, which is disrespectful. It further discusses these verses. It's also a transgression for anybody to leave their relative unburied undernight. It is allowed if it's to wait to get a casket or shrouds. An executed convict is specifically buried in the corpse burial plots, which there were 2 of, one for beheading and strangulation, and one for stoning and burning, the 4 methods of capital punishment. After the flesh decomposes, they're reburied in their proper ancestral burial spot. After the execution, the relatives of the men ask after the welfare of the judges and witnesses to show they hold no animosity. The relatives don't mourn, but they do grieve in their hearts. The Gemara says, in actuality, the person is executed and hung right at sunset, so that way he's put up there for just a few moments and then immediately cut back down and buried. The remaining points are qualified and sourced along with the sources for the requirements for burial. It tries to prove that burial is done to avoid disgrace, and also questions whether eulogies are done for the living or to honor the dead. It discusses this and proves from a source that eulogies are to honor the dead. The convicted men are buried in the court's grave, as a wicked man cannot be buried next to a righteous one, and an extra wicked man cannot be buried next to an ordinary wicked man, which is why there were 2 separate cemeteries. Related, it states that if a person committed a sin, like eating forbidden fats, for instance, and then set aside a chatas offering for repentance, and then became an apostate, and then became religious, the chatas offering can no longer be brought. And the same applies if he became insane and recovered in the meanwhile. It cites both of these cases, as the first one had the man actively disqualify himself, and the second, it's not within his power to revert to his initial state. It brings proofs. It said that both the death and burial atone for the executed men, and they're not mourned, as this is only after they decompose. Others say they're not mourned, as the body is not atoned for until later, after decomposition starts, so they just don't mourn at all. It additionally debates when and in what context the grave could be used for things other than burial, and whether the soil can still be used. It debates the principle further. It discusses whether designations of an item towards particular obligations, like a pouch for its fill-in, makes it forbidden for other uses. It's a rule that designation is not legally considered significant. Another rule, the property of those executed by this king goes to the king, and the property of those executed by the court goes to the executed man's family. Others say even the king's executions has the property go to the man's family. It brings sources on this debate from scripture regarding King David and Yoav. It also debates based on these verses whether Yoav was fully loyal or not to King David, along with some additional points. And that's the end of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Tractate Sanhedrin discusses particular points on the 4 methods of execution. The first Mishnah says, the 4 methods of execution in order of severity are stoning as the most severe, then less, burning, beheading, and then strangulation. Rabbi Shimon says it's burning, stoning, strangulation, and beheading. The procedure of stoning was cited in the prior chapter. The Gemara says, whenever a Mishnah lists an order, there's no significance to the order besides for the list of cleansing agents in Tractate Nida and this, as the order is disputed. Others also add the order of the Yom Kippur service as listed in the earlier Tractate Yoma. It debates other sequences from other Mishnayos. Stoning is said to be the most severe, as it's done for idolatry and blasphemy, which deny fundamental tenets of faith. This is more severe than burning, as is seen that a betrothed female Kohen who committed adultery is stoned, while a married Kohen who does so would be burnt. The members of a city that committed adultery were beheaded, and stoning was more severe as that was done to those that caused this. Stoning is more severe than strangulation, as a betrothed Yisrael who did adultery got stoned instead of strangulation. It cites similar logics for the order of severity between all of the forms of execution, and it also explains the logic of the opposing opinion that says it's burning, stoning, strangulation, and then beheading. It further explains these and debates some sources, and it additionally discusses the punishments for particularities of adultery. It's held if a woman commits adultery below the level of severity of incest with her father, which would result in burning. If it was a Kohen, she receives the higher punishment of burning, and if it's above this level, such as betrothed Yisrael committing adultery, she's sentenced with the same punishment as adultery with her father-in-law, which is stoning. It additionally mentions that none of this is really practically relevant, as all the laws of capital punishment don't apply anymore after the destruction of the temple, and aren't relevant until Moshiach comes, so it's simply studied, similar to the later tractates on laws of temple animal offerings. It brings sources. New Mishnah. The process for burning was as follows. They would position the man in manure up to his knees so he wouldn't move around. They'd put a coarse scarf inside of a soft one, wind it around his neck, and it'd be pulled on both ends, forcing his mouth open. A wick is lit, which will be explained, and put in his mouth to burn his stomach and intestines. Others say this is basically just strangulation, so they pry his mouth open with tongs instead. There was a time a Kohen woman committed adultery, so they put her on a pyre and burnt her. This is not how it's meant to be done, and the court was acting improperly when they did this. The Gemara says, when it says they put a wick down his throat, this means an amount of molten lead that's dumped down his throat and burns straight through his body, killing him instantly. It brings up sources for this principle. Related, it said that Nadav and Avihu said that they'd outlive Moshe and Aaron and lead the generation, so they ended up not doing that. It explains how burning on a pyre is the incorrect practice and was something done by Sadducee heretics. New Mishnah, the process of beheading is as follows. They would decapitate him with a sword in the same way the Roman government did. Others say they put his head on a block and did it with an axe. Others said that this was disgraceful. The Gemara brings sources and says that the members of a city that turned to idolatry are beheaded as are murderers, and it brings sources. New Mishnah. The process of strangulation was as follows. The man would be submerged in manure up to his knees so he couldn't move around. A coarse scarf would be placed inside of a soft one and wound around his neck, and the witnesses would pull either end until he passes. The Gemara cites the scriptural source for this. It also brings the particular wording within verses that reference that the punishment for the violation is specifically through stoning. New Mishnah. The following or stoned. A man who cohabits with his mother or stepmother, with his daughter-in-law, with a male, with an animal, or a woman who cohabits with an animal, a blasphemer, somebody who worships an idol, somebody who gives his offspring to the idol Molech, somebody who does the necromancies of Ov and Yedoni, somebody who violates the Shabbos, somebody who curses his parents, somebody who cohabits with a betrothed young woman, somebody who instigated others to do idolatry, somebody who convinced a city to become idolaters, a sorcerer, and a wayward and rebellious son, which is something that will be particularly discussed in the next chapter, chapter 8. Somebody who cohabits with his mother has done 2 violations, being with his mother and with his father's wife. Others say it's only the first one. Somebody who cohabits with his father's wife is liable for both being with his father's wife and for committing adultery, even if the father had passed. And whether she was only betrothed or married, there's no difference. If somebody cohabits with his daughter-in-law, he's liable for being with his daughter-in-law and for adultery, no matter if his son was alive and whether she was betrothed or married. The Gemara says if the mother was not legally allowed to marry the father, meaning betrothal wasn't valid, he's only liable for being with his mother if he does that. This is debated. The debate as to the particular amount of liabilities for being with one's mother is based on a number of verses which are discussed. It's debated as to which verses are used to reference which exact prohibitions. New Mishnah. As mentioned, cohabiting with another male and with an animal, whether if the person was male or female, resulted in stoning. Additionally, the animal would be stoned, either as the person was stoned due to it, or so people don't identify it as the animal that caused the person to be stoned. The Gemara gives the verses referencing these prohibitions. The remaining sources are listed. If a person cohabits with another male and also receives cohabitation from another male within one period of unawareness, some say he's liable to bring 2 chatas offerings as atonement, others say only 1. The same debate applies with cohabitation with an animal. If somebody did all 4 with other males and with animals all in one period of unawareness, some say he brings 3 chatas offerings, some say 2. It does state that the liability towards the death penalty only applies if all parties involved are old enough that their cohabitation has legal significance. So some say that the death penalty for sodomy is given to the violator if the victim was 9 years old or older. Others say the death penalty is if the victim was 3 years old or older. Obviously, other prohibitions and punishments stand for somebody younger than those, but this is just specifically dealing with laws of the death penalty. If it was bestiality, there's always a death penalty. Liability for bestiality applies whether cohabitation with the man or woman was done in a typical or in an atypical manner. The initial stage of intercourse is forbidden between males, and for bestiality, if a male cohabits with himself, according to the opinion that cohabitation while flaccid is not legally considered to be cohabitation, there's no liability. According to the opinion that there would be 2 liabilities for committing the act and also for being a recipient. In regards to a non-Jewish person, if they committed bestiality, it debates whether the animal would be put to death, as perhaps the Torah isn't really particular about degradation in this regard, and it's focusing more on Jewish people here, but it does objectively cause a downfall. It debates this from a number of sources, although the proofs are all rejected. New Mishnah. The blasphemer is only liable for stoning if he says God's name. When the witness is questioned, he uses a pseudonym so as that way he doesn't repeat the blasphemy. And then after the case, they send everybody out and the witnesses must say exactly what he heard, and all of the judges tear their garments and can never repair them, and the other witnesses just confirm that, saying that they heard likewise. The Gemara gives a source for this. Additionally, the prohibition of blasphemy applies to non-Jewish people too. Although, unlike Jewish people, back when the temple stood and capital punishment was done, the Jewish people were executed by stoning for blasphemy, and the others had beheading. Additionally, there are 7 commandments for non-Jewish people within Judaism called the 7 Noahide laws. They are to not worship idols, to not blaspheme, to not murder, to not steal, to not have forbidden relations, to not eat from the limb of a live animal, meaning to be kind to animals essentially, and to have courts of law and justice. Others said that there were other laws, but those are the 7. It gives the scriptural sources for all of these, citing the verses which show that these prohibitions apply to everybody. It further lists sources for these laws. Some say capital punishment is only given for violation of 3 of these: immorality, murder, and blasphemy. Others also add idolatry. Others say there is no capital punishment for idolatry. Others say there's liability for the violation of any of them. Main principle is, though, that just like all the laws of capital punishment for Jewish people and non-Jewish people, as has been discussed over the past few chapters, that all of this only had practical application in the times of the temple in Judea, when the Sanhedrin stood. When the temple does not stand, there can be no Sanhedrin, and when there's no Sanhedrin, it's forbidden to try capital punishment. And as the temple can only be rebuilt once Moshiach comes, the 7 Noahide laws are no longer enforced principles. Instead, they act as moral guidelines to the rest of the world, which are encouraged through example. Additionally, it is worth adding that while Jewish people have the responsibility to adhere to the 613 commandments of the Torah in order to be able to get to heaven, as non-Jewish people only have an obligation in these 7 commandments as listed here. If they adhere to them, then according to Judaism, they would go straight up to heaven along with everybody else. Anyways, it said testimony in those days was before one judge and required a single witness who had to be male, but could be a relative. Prior warning was not required. It held there was liability for killing a fetus. It debates sources. These laws all apply to men and women. It further gives scriptural sources for these laws. It debates what exactly constitutes liability for immoral cohabitation by these laws. These points are qualified, explaining the particular relatives that are forbidden to all individuals to marry. It's particularly debated if everybody is forbidden to be with their father or sister. It said that this isn't forbidden by non-Jewish people, and it's debated if a sister is allowed. Additionally, a Canaanite slave can marry his mother or daughter, as he's in a sort of in-between status. It's forbidden for a non-Jewish person to cohabit with his designated slave woman. It said there's no liability for them to cohabit with their wives in an atypical manner, but there is for them to do adultery like this. It also says there was liability in those days if they struck a Jewish person. Related, it said if somebody raises his hand against their fellow, even if they didn't strike them, they're called wicked. Others say he's called a sinner, others say his hand should be cut off, and similar. Some hold there's liability for non-Jewish people to cease working for a full day, although this is not included among the Noahide laws. There's a debate if non-Jewish people can learn Torah. Rabbi Yochanan, for instance, says it's forbidden and they're liable to death from God. Rabbi Meir disagrees, saying a non-Jewish person who learns Torah is as worthy as a Kohen Gadol. They cite verses. Some say Rabbi Meir means they have this special worth if they study things applicable to them, like the Noahide laws. It's debated if non-Jewish people are forbidden from eating blood, as Jewish people are forbidden. It said any of the Noahide laws repeated at Mount Sinai apply to both Jewish people and non-Jewish people, and if they were only said as Noahide laws, that means they only apply to Jewish people, as there's nothing that a Jewish person is allowed to do that a non-Jewish person isn't allowed to do. The laws of conversion of captives in battle does not count, as that only had application during the conquest of Israel in biblical times, and liability for theft of an item less than a pruta applies to non-Jewish people, but that also applies to Jewish people too. It's just that Jewish people tend to pardon a crime that small. It also cites verses explaining why non-Jewish people aren't obligated in circumcision, and cites verses sourcing liability for eating the limb of a living animal. It's debated as to whether Adam was allowed to eat meat. It said no, and it also explains the uses of all the animals which he used for work. It said that Adam did eat meat according to some, fed to him by angels, which caused the serpent to become jealous. And it cites another incident where a sage was surrounded by lions, so he quoted a verse and pieces of meat descended from heaven, and it was said that they must have been kosher as they came from heaven, even if it resembled the meat of a non-kosher animal. As mentioned, others held that non-Jewish people had additional prohibitions besides for the 7 Noahide laws, which weren't made part of the final 7, prohibitions against sorcery and forbidden plant mixtures, and it cites the sources. Back to the prohibition against blasphemy, it said that this applies if the 4-letter name of God was used. Others say it's even the 4-letter name, and including the long 42-letter name of God. It sources the remaining points, including the obligation of the court to tear their garments once they hear the blasphemy. It said if somebody hears a non-Jewish person saying God's name in vain, tearing garments is not required. Others disagree. It's also said, based on this, that by all testimony, by monetary or capital cases, one witness can give testimony, and the other can just say he saw the same. Other transgressions punished with stoning, serving an idol, slaughtering an offering to an idol, or burning the offering, or pouring libations, bowing to one, accepting an idol as a deity, or saying it's his god. If the person embraces, kisses, sweeps, sprinkles water, washes, anoints, clothes, or puts shoes on an idol, this is only a negative commandment, as is vowing or swearing in the name of an idol. The worship of the idol Baal Peor was done by using the restroom before it. The worship of the idol Marculus was done by throwing a stone before it. The Gemara says, serving an idol means serving it in its typical manner of service. Bringing the offering is still prohibited, even if it's not the main method of service. It gives sources for all these points. It's debated as to whether an animal sacrificed for idolatry can be benefited from. There's no liability if somebody does a non-typically worshipful act before a different variant of idol. For instance, defecating was the service for the idol Baal Peor, so that would result in liability if done before the idol of Baal Peor, but defecating before the idol of Marculus would not result in a liability. There are qualifications as to what constitutes instigation towards idolatry. These points are additionally discussed. If somebody served an idol out of love or fear of another person, it's debated if he's liable. Some say yes, as he worshipped the idol. Others say no, as he didn't accept it as a deity. It's debated from several sources. It said if somebody slaughtered an offering to an idol, burnt it, and poured libations and bowed to it all in one period of unawareness, he's liable to bring only one chatas offering. Others disagree. It's argued on. This is all discussed further. It said if a person said, "You are my God," to an idol unintentionally, he needs to bring an offering. Regarding the sequence of other actions, which are only a negative commandment, hugging, kissing, sweeping, sprinkling, etc., all of these have a liability of lashes, besides for swearing and vowing to the idol, as that has no action. This is sourced. Some even say it's forbidden to make a business partnership with somebody who worships an idol in case the man ends up swearing by the idol. It also says you're allowed to mention the name of an idol that's within Scripture. It cites related verses, and it gives a list of scriptural idols and what they resembled. It's also said the Jewish people who had resorted to idolatry didn't do it because they believed in it. They did so just because they wanted to commit immoral acts. They only started to enjoy it after they became attached to it. It was said idolatry was such an issue that the sages fasted for 3 days and nights and prayed, and a note from heaven fell which said truth, which is the signet of God. And then a fiery lion cub of a sort appeared from the innermost part of the temple, and the prophet Zechariah told them that this is the inclination for idolatry. So they captured it, save for a hair which fell off, and stuffed it into a lead cauldron and sealed it. This action removed the innate desire within all people to serve idols, which used to be a thing the same way people used to desire after other sins. They also prayed to have the inclination for immorality appear, which it did, and they tied it up. But then animals stopped reproducing and there were no more eggs, so they just blinded it and thereby struck out the desire for cohabitation with one's relatives. It further cites incidents showing the service of Baal Peor, saying there's liability for defecating before it, even if the intent was to degrade it, as there's liability for throwing rocks at the idol Marculus, even if the intent was to stone it. A sage once did this, throwing rocks at the idol Marculus to insult it, and then realized his mistake, but he didn't remove the rocks, as that leaves room for more rocks to be thrown. New Mishnah. One of the forbidden forms of idolatry was the worship of the idol Molech, which is specifically the process of passing a child through a fire to the idol. The Gemara says this is said separately, as it's like the opinion that the service of this idolatry is only impermissible specifically if done for the idol Molech. The concept of this was handing a child through a fire to one of the idol's stewards. Some say there's liability if this is done with some of your children, as the verse says, of your offspring, meaning a person wouldn't be liable if he did this with all of his kids. There would be liability for doing this service with legitimate or illegitimate offspring. The typical manner of this service was a column of bricks in the middle with fire on either side that the child is passed over. Others said it was a fire pit that was jumped over. The sources for liability are discussed. New Mishnah. Another transgression punished by stoning was the necromancy of Ov, which involved somebody raising a spirit and having it communicate with them from their underarm, and the necromancy of Yedoni, which involved the voice coming from his mouth. Practicing these results in stoning, and there's a prohibition to inquire of a practitioner. The Gemara says the source lists both Ov and Yedoni. Others mention just Ov, as they were both mentioned as one negative commandment, and Ov is first, or as Yedoni doesn't involve an action. This is debated. It said that blasphemy does involve an action, moving the mouth, and the Ov had to clap his arms for it to work. It tries to draw comparison with other forbidden practices, like burning incense to summon demons and similar. These are additionally debated. It also describes these practices. The Yedoni puts a bone of a certain animal called a Yadua in his mouth, and it speaks to him. There are further particularities in these ceremonies mentioned, and it discusses some related verses and other forms of prohibited necromancy and augury. New Mishnah. Violating Shabbos results in stoning if intentional, and has the punishment of karos, which is divine punishment. If unintentional, there is a requirement to bring a chatas offering to the temple. The Gemara says this implies there's a violation on Shabbos which has no punishment at all, and depending on the opinion, this would be leaving the techum boundary or kindling of flame. New Mishnah. Cursing one's parents results in stoning, only if done with the name of God. It is debated as to if this applies if you used a subordinate name. The Gemara brings sources and additionally discusses these points. New Mishnah. There is only stoning for cohabiting with a betrothed young woman if she's betrothed, a na'ara, having just entered adulthood, a virgin, and in her father's house. If two men cohabited with her, the first gets stoning, the second gets strangulation. The Gemara brings sources from Scripture. If a father betrothed his minor daughter to marry when she eventually becomes an adult, and somebody cohabited, God forbid, with the girl prior to her becoming an adult, it's debated if he receives the death penalty for this. A Kohen woman who does adultery uniquely has burning instead, although if it was with a disqualified person first, it's strangulation. New Mishnah. An instigator towards idolatry is also stoned. This is an ordinary person who instigated an ordinary person, convincing him to worship an idol. By just about every single law in Torah, it's forbidden to have witnesses lie in wait and try and get somebody to commit a violation to trap them. This is the only exception. If he spoke to two people, they can act as witnesses. The entrapment is allowed here if he's only speaking to one person by having witnesses lie in wait behind a wall and have him convince a man, and the instigator should be discouraged. But if he persists, the witnesses then come out and take him to court, where he'll be then tried and stoned. It lists a number of possible phrases that an instigator could say that cause liability. Let us go serve an idol. I will burn an offering. Let us go bow down, and many others. The Gemara cites the source for these opinions, and additionally describes the process of entrapment. New Mishnah. A subverter is a person who convinces a whole city to worship idols. A sorcerer refers to actual sorcery, not to somebody that just does illusions and magic tricks. The Gemara discusses these points. It also discusses further scriptural sources on sorcery and additionally qualifies as to what exactly constitutes a prohibition here, giving many different accounts of different forms of sorcery that were witnessed and differentiation between actual sorcery and just ordinary illusions. One incident, a man received a drink at an inn, and the waitress was mouthing something, so he poured out some of the water secretly, and it turned into scorpions. So he had her drink it, and she turned into a donkey, and he rode the donkey to the market, and then her friend saw this and dissolved the spell, and he was seen sitting on top of the woman in the market. It's also said that by the 10 plagues, by the exodus from Egypt, by the frog plague, the verse says frog in singular, so some say this means it was just one big giant frog that spat out tiny little frogs. One sage, Rabbi Eliezer, was excommunicated due to a different story back from Tractate Bava, and he was mourning that he had only imparted a fraction of his knowledge to his students. He once showed his student Rabbi Akiva the laws of planting and uprooting cucumbers via sorcery, and uprooted and replanted an entire field. So the student asked him to clarify some laws of purity before he passed, which he did. He then passed, and the excommunication was annulled. The sorcery was permitted in that case when he was teaching a student, as it was for study, where it is allowed. And that's the end of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Tractate Sanhedrin covers further laws of court, here in regards to the laws of the wayward and rebellious son. The first Mishnah says, a ben soirer umayre, a wayward and rebellious son, refers to a boy who commits particular sins involving theft and gluttony, and will be described further. It's mostly mentioned in these verses from the Torah. The punishment for this was stoning. This only had application during particular stages of the boy's physical development, which are described as being from the boy growing 2 hairs until the point in time of physical development that there is hair grown around his genitals. It says scriptural sources. A minor does not have this apply to him, as he's not responsible for the commandments. The Gemara says, you might have thought that a minor does have application by this, and the person's being punished for the eventual outcome of his behavior. It particularly qualifies the signs of physical development that create this limited window where these laws apply. A rebellious son is also disqualified if he is a father. It debates if a minor boy is even physically capable of becoming a father. In fact, the entire window of time when a boy can be classified as a rebellious son is only within 3 months, so it's doubtful that it even be possible to father a child within this window. It debates as to what this refers to. It further argues on this. It agrees that cohabitation of a boy under 8 years old isn't even considered to be a legally significant act, and between 8 and 9 is debated from scriptural verses which imply, based on the accounting, that Haran had Sarah when he was 8 years old, meaning it would be physically possible in theory, but it debates this further from other verses. New Mishnah. A boy is liable for being a ben soirer umayra, a wayward and rebellious son, once he eats a tartamar, which is a very large measurement of meat, and drinks half a lug of Italian wine. Others say it's a mana of meat and a lug of wine. This doesn't count if it was eaten in certain circumstances, such as at a mitzvah gathering, at a meal to announce Elite Month, as a Meiser She'eni tithe, if it was non-kosher meat or untithed produce or unredeemed produce or anything that was specifically a mitzvah or a sin to eat, or it was any food that wasn't meat or any drink that wasn't wine. In all these instances, there would be no liability. The Gemara says, logically, a tartamar measurement would be half a mana. Additionally, for this liability to apply, it must be specifically with partially diluted wine and partially cooked meat. It cannot be salted meat, and it cannot be fresh wine. It qualifies the exact measurement. It speaks at length on the great negative effects of wine, particularly on Noah, who got drunk and his son Ham saw him. Some say his son castrated him so that way he wouldn't have a 4th son. Others say he also sodomized him. Some say that the tree of knowledge was a grapevine. Others say it was a stalk of wheat. Others say it was a fig tree. It discusses some further verses. Others add the rebellious son is only liable if he eats the meat and wine within a gathering of people of poor character, as long as it wasn't for a mitzvah. This doesn't apply if the meat was bird. It gives examples of mitzvah and sin meals to comfort mourners and eating on a public fast day, for example. New Mishnah. Another qualification, he is only this rebellious son if he specifically steals the food from his father and eats it in another man's domain. Others say he has to steal it from his father and mother. The Gemara qualifies these points as to why it needs to be this case. Specifically, New Mishnah, the boy is only liable for being a rebellious son if both his father and mother are willing to prosecute him for this. Others add he cannot be liable if his mother wasn't allowed to be married to his father. The Gemara explains this last point. It actually means that they need to physically look similar in voice, appearance, and height for him to be able to be liable as a rebellious son. Based on all of these details, some say it was essentially impossible for there to ever have been a ben soirer umayra, a wayward and rebellious son, who would be liable for capital punishment. Others say he knew of one particular case where this had actually occurred. It similarly says that there was never a case of a city that was subverted to idolatry, It's debated if there was ever an actual case of a house whose walls were afflicted with tsaras as described in Scripture. New Mishnah. Additionally, the rebellious son cannot be liable if either parent was missing a hand, or was lame, or was mute, or blind, or deaf. This is based on a number of verses. Additionally, if all of this occurs, the parents warn him before 3 and the court flogs him. For him to be liable for capital punishment, he needs to repeat it after this and then be judged by a court of 23 that must include the original 3 judges. The Gemara tries to suggest from here that processes and verses need to be carried out precisely as described. We say that this is unique here as the verse is redundant. The parents actually need to warn him before 2 witnesses. It cites some scriptural sources. New Mishnah. If the boy ran away before he was judged and he reached a stage of physical development past his limited window, if he had fled before the verdict was reached, he'd still be liable. The Gemara says, related, if a non-Jewish person blasphemes and then converts to Judaism, he's exempt from any liability. It brings sources for these points and debates them. New Mishnah. A rebellious son, if he fulfills all of these criteria, is judged due to what he'll eventually become, so that way he should die while he's innocent. The death of the wicked is beneficial to them and the world, while for the righteous, it's detrimental to them and the world. It also says wine and sleep, along with dispersal, are beneficial to the wicked and the world, but detrimental for the righteous and the world. But assembly and tranquility for the righteous are beneficial to them and the world, unlike by the wicked. The Gemara additionally qualifies these points. New Mishnah. A burglar tunneling into a house is judged based on what he'll eventually do. If the burglar broke a barrel while breaking in, if the burglar in that circumstance is allowed to be killed, he's exempt for paying for the barrel. The Gemara says the presumption is people would defend themselves in their house, so if somebody's breaking into a house, they're prepared to kill anybody inside, and accordingly a person is allowed to kill anybody that's trying to kill him. It debates if such a burglar is exempt for stealing the actual barrels. It discusses some particular incidents. It is agreed that a person can kill an ordinary burglar. If a person is burgling from his son, if the son knows the father will kill him, he's allowed to kill him first. Otherwise, he cannot. A tunneling burglar can even be killed on Shabbos. If, for instance, debris fell on somebody's father tunneling into his son's house on Shabbos, he cannot kill him, and he's actually allowed to violate the Shabbos to save him. Additionally, this doesn't only apply to somebody tunneling into somebody's house. This would also apply if he was coming in through a roof or otherwise. Tunnels were just mentioned as they were a bit more common. If a minor tries to kill somebody, the person is allowed to defend himself and kill the attacker. As this opinion holds, you don't need to warn somebody pursuing you. However, this opinion does not hold that a mother can abort her child if it will kill her. It debates sources. New Mishnah. A person is allowed to kill a man who is trying to kill him or somebody else, or trying to violate a male or a female. You don't kill a person to stop them from doing bestiality, or for desecrating Shabbos, or doing idolatry. The Gemara said scriptural sources. There's an additional obligation to save somebody's life if they're drowning or being attacked by animals. These points are additionally qualified. It's discussed if a woman is being violated and she requests that it be allowed so that way she won't be killed, she cannot be rescued if it'll result in her dying. This is debated. It qualifies these points further and cites a few disputing opinions. Generally, a person should rather sin than be killed, besides for the sins of committing idolatry, cohabiting immorally, or killing another person. This applies when the government isn't actively trying to make decrees to end Torah observance. If they are, a person should die rather than give up any commandment, if in public at least, with 10 Jewish people present. Queen Esther was allowed to impermissibly cohabit with King Ahasuerus, either as she was completely passive in the act, or because it was done for his own personal desire. It said these principles apply with the 7 Noahide laws too. It had a particular case where a man was so obsessed with a woman that he began dying, and the doctor said he should cohabit with her, but it was said that it was a form of forbidden relations, so he couldn't. And she wasn't even permitted to stand before him unclothed or similar. Marriage wouldn't have worked there, as it said that since the temple was destroyed, the enjoyment of intimacy was taken from marriage and given to sinners. And that's the end of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Tractate Sanhedrin discusses the final forms of capital punishment. The first Mishnah says, the following were executed via burning. Somebody who cohabits with a woman and her daughter, or his granddaughter, or his wife's daughter, or granddaughter, or his mother-in-law, or his mother-in-law's mother, or his father-in-law's mother. Also, a married Kohen woman who commits adultery would receive burning. The Gemara discusses and sources all of these points. These principles are discussed further. It additionally explains sources prohibiting all of these relatives, and additionally brings sources prohibiting a man from cohabiting with his daughter born from his violation of a woman. It also says, based on a verse, it's an extremely improper thing to marry a young daughter to an old man, or to marry a woman to a minor son, or to return a lost object to an idol worshipper. There are further points. New Mishnah. The following were executed via beheading. A murderer and the people of a city subverted to idolatry. Examples of murder include hitting somebody with a stone or iron, or holding somebody down in water or in fire. These would cause liability. He's not liable if he pushed the man into water or fire, and the man could have escaped, but he just chose not to. A person is not liable if he incited a dog or a snake to kill somebody, If he directly caused the snake to bite somebody, it's debated. The Gemara qualifies these points further. There was a case where somebody locked an animal in the sun and it died, and it was debated if the man was liable for this. If a person tied somebody and the guy starved to death, he's not liable for execution. If he bound somebody in the sun or cold and the man died, he is liable. If he bound him and the sun or cold came later, he is not liable. If somebody tied somebody before a lion, he's not liable, as the guy would have died anyways. If he tied him and he was eaten by gnats, he would be liable for execution, as the man would have been able to shoo them away. Others say he's not liable, as the gnats that ate him could have been different gnats. If somebody put a barrel on a sleeping man and suffocated him, or knocked a hole and caused him to die from cold, it's debated if he's liable. It debates some related cases. Further, if somebody shoved somebody into a pit with a ladder, and then somebody else removed the ladder, the first man is not liable for execution. Similarly, if somebody shot an arrow at somebody with a shield, and somebody grabbed the shield away, the first man is not liable. In fact, if he shot an arrow at somebody and the man had medicine that could heal him, and then somebody threw out the medicine, he's not liable. This would apply even if the medicine was in the market, or if it became available afterwards. If somebody threw a rock at a wall and it rebounded and killed somebody, he's liable for the death penalty. This is qualified regarding the intended rebounding of the ball. There are other cases, for instance, if somebody throws a rock straight up, but it goes to the side and kills somebody, the thrower is liable, as it's still his force. If 10 men beat somebody with clubs and he dies, some say they're not liable for execution, others say it was one man after the other and the last striker would be liable. It gives sources and disputes this. If a person hits somebody hard enough to kill them and then another man comes and hits the man, the second man would be liable for killing him. There are further points on killing with animals. The debate as to whether directly causing a snake to kill somebody is on if the venom ejects automatically from the snake, in which case the killer is liable for beheading and the snake is not stoned. And if the venom comes out if the snake wants it to, the snake would be stoned and the man would be exempt. New Mishnah. If a person strikes a man with a stone or his fist and the judges assessed and said he would die, but the man gets better and then dies afterwards, the attacker is still liable. Others say he's not. The Gemara said scriptural sources and additionally discussed this dispute. New Mishnah. If a person intended to kill an animal where there's no capital punishment, but killed a man where there is, or intended to kill a non-Jewish person and killed a Jewish person, or intended to kill a premature fetus and killed a viable child, there's no liability for execution. If somebody intended to hit somebody in the leg, not hard enough to kill him, and it hit his chest and it killed them, he's not liable. If he intended to hit the chest, hard enough to kill there, but hit his leg instead, not hard enough to kill, but the man died, he is not liable. If somebody meant to hit an adult, and it wasn't hard enough to kill, but it hit a child and it killed the child, he's not liable for execution. If he meant to hit a child hard enough to kill, and hit the adult, not hard enough to kill, but the man died anyways, he is not liable. If he intended to hit somebody's leg hard enough to kill there and hit the chest and he died, he would be liable for execution. Or if he meant to hit an adult hard enough to kill and hit and killed a child, he'd be liable. Others disagree, saying if he meant to kill one person and hit another, he's not liable. The Gemara debates, what if the killer said he intended to kill one of two people, but didn't specify which, or he thought he had killed one and then discovered it was the other? The latter opinion holds it's only a capital offense if he specifically said he intended to kill the particular man. It gives sources and debates this. If somebody intends to kill one man and kills another, some say he's executed, others say he pays monetarily, others say he's not liable for either. New Mishnah. If a murderer was mixed up with others, some say they're all exempt, others say they're all put in a cell, which will be explained. If multiple people who were to receive capital punishment were all mixed up, they'd receive the more lenient type between them, based on what you'd hold was the order of leniency. The Gemara explains the point on putting them in a cell. The case is a murderer with a non-finalized verdict being mixed up with murderers with finalized verdicts. Some say they're exempt, others say as they're all murderers, they're put in a cell and killed indirectly, which will be explained soon. Others say this case takes place with murderous oxen. These points are debated further, and there is some additional discussion on this. New Mishnah. Somebody liable to two forms of capital punishment receives the more severe variant. If the transgression had liability for two forms of capital punishment, some say it's the more severe one, others say it's the first one. The Gemara additionally qualifies and sources these points. If somebody was flogged for committing a transgression and then it happened again, the court can execute him indirectly by putting him in a cell and feeding him barley until his stomach bursts. The Gemara explains the floggings were for kares penalties, which is for divine punishment, so he's condemned to die, but he just hasn't died yet. This is qualified further and it additionally describes the process. New Mishnah. If somebody kills somebody and there are no witnesses, he's imprisoned and fed small portions of bread and water. The Gemara explains this is where there were two witnesses that he murdered somebody, but it was either invalid as they were isolated from each other or had minor discrepancies. So he's fed the small portions until his stomach shrinks, and then they feed him barley until his stomach bursts. New Mishnah. If somebody steals a kasva, which will be defined as a temple service vessel, or blasphemes by a supernatural force, or cohabits with an Aramean woman, a zealot is allowed to kill him. If a Kohen serves in the temple while impure, the young Kohanim can take him to the courtyard and beat him to death with clubs. If a non-Kohen serves in the temple, some say he's executed via strangulation, some say by God. The Gemara qualifies these points further. It cites verses and additionally discusses these prohibitions, particularly by Pinchas and Zimri. One of the princes of the 12 tribes publicly sinned while the Jewish people were wandering through the desert after leaving Egypt by cohabiting with the Midianite woman Cosbi. So while everybody was trying to figure out what to do, Pinchas stepped up and just killed them both. It said that Pinchas managed to sneak into the camp and to near their tent by removing the spear tip and hiding it and using the stick as a walking staff and pretending he was going to participate. There were 6 miracles done for Pinchas. Zimri could have ceased his cohabitation to avoid being killed, but did not. Zimri didn't cry out for help. Pinchas precisely stabbed the spear through both Zimri and Cosbi's genitalia. Zimri and Cosbi both remained on the spear like that. He lifted them through the tent, and the lintel of the tent was miraculously lifted, and an angel came and caused chaos through the camp so that way nobody could stop Pinchas. He then dropped off the bodies and argued that the plague should stop, which was going on at that time. Pinchas was noted by his lineage as being a Kohen, as people mocked his lineage after this incident. It lengthily details the extent of the sin between Zimri and Cosbi, going into a lot of detail. The remaining points are discussed further, and it also qualifies their prohibitions by the improper service of the Kohanim. It brings sources for the laws and additional discussion, and there are further principles on this, and that's the end of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Tractate Sanhedrin completes the discussion on the laws of capital punishment. The first Mishnah says, "The following are transgressions that were punished with execution via strangulation. Somebody who strikes their father or mother, somebody who kidnaps a Jewish person, a sage who refuses to accept the ruling of the court, a false prophet, somebody who prophesies in the name of a false god, somebody who commits adultery, people who testify falsely that a Kohen woman committed adultery, and the man who committed adultery with a Kohen woman." The Gemara provides scriptural sources for these punishments, being via strangulation. It also provides sources that liability here for striking one's parents is only if they create a wound. Due to the severity of the sin, many sages wouldn't even allow their sons to remove a splinter from them, and similar as it could unintentionally result in this transgression. This is unlike removing a thorn from skin on Shabbos, where it is allowed, as that wouldn't even cause liability if it was done intentionally, as it's not needed for its defined purpose, which this opinion holds you'd be exempt for. It debates whether a son can be appointed by a court to administer lashes to his father. It debates it from a number of discussions, and cites a source which says there's no liability for cursing or striking a condemned man. However, a son is liable for cursing his father even after his father's passing, so this wouldn't count. Rather, it's held that a court is not allowed to appoint a son to punish his father through striking or cursing, unless the father had committed the unique transgression of instigating others towards idolatry, in which case the son can fulfill this position. New Mishnah. Somebody who strikes his father and mother is only liable if he wounds them. There's liability for cursing one's parents after their passing, but not for striking. The Gemara cites sources. Additionally, this opinion holds there's no liability for cursing or striking particularly sinful parents. Based on a verse, this is debated. New Mishnah. The liability for kidnapping a Jewish person applies if he takes the man into his possession. Others say there's only liability if he also makes use of him. There's debate if there's liability for kidnapping one's own son or for kidnapping a half-slave. The Gemara says the debate if the kidnapped individual needs to be worked or not is if the kidnapper is liable for execution. If somebody kidnaps a sleeping person or kidnaps a pregnant woman, but specifically for the baby and made use of them by leaning on them or something, it's unresolved if this is considered to be a normal manner of usage. It brings further sources. There's no liability of execution if the kidnapper didn't sell the victim, or if he sold him but kept him in his domain, or if he sold the man to his father or brother, or if he kidnapped a slave. Others debate these points. It explains the sources of the dispute on whether a person is liable for kidnapping his son or a half-slave. Additionally, the verse within the 10 Commandments saying, "do not steal," actually refers specifically to kidnapping. The liability of execution applies if the kidnapped individual was sold into slavery. If one set of witnesses testify to the kidnapping and one set testifies to the sale into slavery, and they're both proven to be lying, some say the witnesses are punished with execution, others say not, as it was 2 half testimonies which would have been insufficient. Regarding a Ben Sira Umaira, a rebellious son, as discussed a few chapters ago, the set of witnesses towards the second time he commits the violation are considered to be testifying on a complete matter, so if they're proven false, it's agreed that they would be executed. The difference between cases is disputed. If witnesses just testify towards sale of the kidnapped man and are then discredited, they would not be executed, as the man could have pleaded that he was just selling his slave, for instance. Others say it wasn't viable anyways, as it was just a half testimony. This would apply even if the witnesses to the kidnapping signal to the witnesses to the sale that they would testify. That would still hold no legal significance. New Mishnah. A sage who refuses to listen to the ruling of the court also receives this capital punishment. There were 3 courts in Jerusalem, one by the Temple Mount, one by the Temple Courtyard, and one within the actual temple. If a sage argued his opinion before the Temple Mount court and he's rejected, he goes up to the court by the Temple Courtyard and argues his opinion. And if that doesn't work, he goes to the high court within the temple, and if they reject that and he goes home and teaches like his incorrect opinion, he's not liable. But if he instructed people to act like his opinion, he would be liable for execution in such a situation. If this was just a student that did this, he would not be liable. The Gemara cites scriptural sources for this principle. It debates which laws that the sage is incorrectly teaching that this applies to. Some say only a violation which is punished with the penalty of kares, divine punishment, if done intentionally. Others say it applies to laws written in scripture and expounded on by the sages. Others say it even applies to laws made by inference to bring sources, and it debates this by a number of particular cases. These points are all discussed further. It also explains how the courts and judges would distribute ruling back in those days from the greater Sanhedrin and down to the smaller courts, as there was very little debate on rulings, at least up until the times of the schools of Hillel and Shammai, who dispute on many laws all throughout the Gemara. The remaining points are qualified. New Mishnah. Regarding the law of a rebellious sage, the laws that are stated in the Torah and expounded on by the sages are held stricter. For instance, if a sage says that there is no commandment of tefillin which directly contradicts a statement of the Torah, he would not be liable here. If he said that there are 5 compartments in the tefillin instead of 4, contradicting the teachings, he would be liable. The Gemara clarifies that this liability only applies if it's such a teaching that he adds to and thereby disqualifies the commandment. The only thing that really meets this criteria is tefillin. It explains why this wouldn't apply by other obligations like lulav or mezuzah. New Mishnah. The rebellious sage is brought to the high court in Jerusalem where he's guarded until the holiday, and they execute him. Then, as the verse states, it must be heard by the entire nation. Others say he's executed immediately, and they just send out messengers. The Gemara discusses this and lists other transgressions that the execution is publicized: instigation towards idolatry, a wayward and rebellious son, a rebellious sage, as discussed, and false witnesses. It brings sources. New Mishnah. A false prophet is one who prophesies about things he never actually heard, or something said to a different prophet, but not to him. He's executed by the court. A prophet who refuses to give over his prophecy, and somebody who ignored the words of a prophecy, and a prophet who transgressed his own words are all liable for death from heaven. The court's execution applies if somebody prophesies in the name of an idol, even if it's true. Somebody who cohabits with a married woman after she's entered her husband's domain, even if she hadn't cohabited with her husband yet, the adulterer is subject to strangulation. The false witnesses of a Kohen woman who did adultery, including the person who did the adultery here, are liable for strangulation, as typically a false witness gets punished with whatever punishment he testified about to try and give. Besides for here, where the adulterous woman would have gone burning, and here the false witness instead gets strangulation. The Gemara cites scriptural sources for all of this. It cites many verses giving instances of these concepts of false prophecy, for instance, prophesying for an idol, like the prophets of Baal, and refusing to prophesize like Yonah and others. It expounds on further verses regarding Abraham and his trial to offer up his son Yitzchak. It said that the Satan came up to him and tried to dissuade him, but Abraham refused to bring sources for the remaining points, and these are all discussed further. And that's the end of chapter 10. Chapter 11, the final chapter of Tractate Sanhedrin, gives lengthy discussion on the coming of Moshiach and the resurrection of the dead. The first Mishnah says, all of Israel has a share in the world to come, as the verse states, and your people are all righteous, forever shall they inherit the land, the branch of my plantings, my handiwork, in which to take pride. The following do not have the share: those who deny the resurrection of the dead, or say the Torah isn't from heaven, or a heretic. Others add those who read external books, which will be defined, or somebody who encants over a wound, and some add somebody who pronounces God's name according to its letters. 3 kings do not have a share in the world to come: Yerovam, Achav, and Menashe. There are 4 common men who don't have a share: Bilam, Doeg, Achitophel, and Gehazi. The Gemara explains, God punishes measure for measure, so if somebody denies the resurrection of the dead, he doesn't receive it. It now goes through many scriptural sources and allusions towards the concept of Moshiach and the resurrection of the dead. The verse says, and you shall give from it God's teruma to Aaron the Kohen. Teruma was given in Israel, which Aaron never entered, so it must refer to the future after the resurrection. Others simply interpret this to mean men like Aaron, meaning Kohanim, along with several points on not giving teruma tithes to ignoramus Kohanim, which are discussed. Another verse, as it says, and I have also established my covenant with them to give to them the land of Canaan. It says to them, not to you, referencing the future. There were a number of verses the sage Rabban Gamliel referenced an argument, and God said to Moshe, behold, you will lie with your forefathers and rise. It was counter-argued that the context doesn't really reference that, so he quoted the verse, may your dead live, O command my people's corpses shall rise, awake and sing, you who dwell on the earth. It was argued that perhaps this referred to the dead resurrected by Yechezkel. There's the verse, going to my beloved with sincerity, stirring the lips of those who sleep. But they argued perhaps this is a reference to the teaching that when somebody teaches a law in somebody's name, their lips move from the grave. So we quoted the verse, on the land that God swore to your forefathers to give to them. It says to them specifically, and also the verse, and you who cleave to Hashem your God are alive, all of you today. Today is redundant. It's interpreted to mean on that day, referencing the future. It was argued to the Romans from the verse, behold, you will lie with your forefathers and rise, among other sources, Queen Cleopatra, although it mentions in commentary it wasn't the famous Queen Cleopatra, it was just another queen of the same name, spoke to Rabbi Meir, asking on these verses, "And they shall blossom forth from the city like the grass of the earth," which references the resurrection, and she wanted to know if they would arise clothed. So Rabbi Meir responded, saying that wheat is buried unclothed and arises covered, so too will the righteous. It says a number of similar conversations and incidents. Another incident, it says the descendants of the ancient Canaanites came from Africa to argue with the Jewish people before Alexander of Macedon, claiming they had the rights to the land of Canaan, but they counter-argued by quoting the verse that says the ancient ancestor of Canaan was cursed as a slave to Shem and Japheth, so they had no right to the land. Similarly, the Egyptians came before Alexander of Macedon to argue they wanted repayment for the treasures the Jewish people took upon leaving Egypt, so they counter-argued, saying by that regard they would need payment for the 430 years of slavery. Another time, the descendants of Yishmael and Keturah came before Alexander and argued they have the rights to the land, as the verse says they're a descendant of Abraham. So it was counter-argued, but the verse also says that Abraham gave all that was his to Yitzchak, Isaac, in gifts to his other sons, and had them leave to other lands. It explains that these gifts he gave them were the arts of sorcery. Marcus Aurelius, the good friend of the sage Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, frequently conversed with him, and Marcus Aurelius argued, saying the body and soul could respectively argue that neither are at fault for sin, as once each left, the other stopped doing wrong. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi gave the analogy of two thieves stealing from an orchard, one blind and one lame, and they sat on each other's shoulders, the blind man walking and the lame man guiding, so they were eventually caught and judged together on each other's shoulders, as they had committed the crime, so too the body and soul are combined and judged. Marcus Aurelius asked Rebbe why the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. Rebbe responds, if it was the inverse, he'd have asked the same. So he asked, why does it go across the east and west completely? And he said, to offer greetings to God at its peak, and it stretches all the way across to help workers and travelers. Marcus Aurelius also taught Rebbe, saying that the soul must enter the body immediately upon conception, as all meat without a soul rots within days. And Rebbe agreed. He also taught Rebbe that it must be that the evil inclination only influences a person from birth, as otherwise it'd try and leave the womb prematurely. And Rebbe also agreed and cited a verse as proof for this. It cites many verses regarding the resurrection of the dead. It said that the dead will rise and then be healed. It said that the Jewish people will rise and live forever, and even the non-Jewish people too will participate, being granted extremely long lives. There are further points and many additional verses cited referencing scriptural allusion towards the resurrection. There are more sources, for instance, may Reuven live and not die, the latter part being a reference. Of course, there's the verse, and many of those who sleep in the dusty earth shall awaken, these for everlasting life, and these for shame, for everlasting abhorrence. And as for you, go to the end, and you repose, and you will arise to your lot at the end of days. There are many further teachings on the great importance of understanding and teaching Torah and helping Torah scholars and humility. It cites more verses. It also says the dead that the prophet Yechezkel resurrected were the sons of the tribe of Ephraim, who miscalculated the dates of the slavery of Egypt and tried to escape too early and were all killed. Others say it was those that denied the final resurrection. There are other suggestions. It also discusses Nebuchadnezzar's attempted burning of Hananiah, Michael, and Azariah, saying there were 6 miracles. Then the furnace rose to ground level and the wall was breached, its foundation caved in. Nebuchadnezzar's idol fell over, the royal parties burned, and Yechezkel resurrected the dead. These are all passed by tradition, besides for the burning of the 4 kingdoms, which is alluded to by scripture. From this whole thing, we can learn that a person in mortal danger should maintain his dignified bearing. It debates as to what exactly happened to them and as to what Daniel was doing at this time. It said that the false prophets Achav and Tzidkiyahu tried to be tested by Nebuchadnezzar in the same way, requesting that they also be thrown in the furnace, and asking the Kohen Gadol Yeshua be tossed in too. So they were, and 2 of them were burned, and the Kohen Gadol's clothes were singed as his sons married women unfit for the Kohana, and he hadn't protested to that. It expounds upon many related verses. There were also many verses on Chizkiah and his wars, and it says he was almost the Moshiach, but not quite, along with some points on Sennacherib, his many names, how he exiled the 10 tribes, some say to Africa, some say to the mountains of Selug. There are many teachings on the wickedness of Sennacherib. It further lists events of Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem. It also cites an incident when King David was going out hunting and was chasing a deer until he eventually entered the land of the Philistines. When Yishai ben Nov, the brother of Goliath, saw him and tried to kill him by crushing him beneath an olive press, but the ground underneath David softened and he was unharmed. In the meanwhile, Avishai, David's officer, was washing and he saw blood in the water, although some say it was a dove that landed before him and started thrashing. So he ran to find David using King David's horse, and the ground contracted, allowing him to go faster. Goliath and Yishbi's mother, Orpah, threw a spindle at him, and it missed, so she tried to pretend it wasn't her, so Avishai threw it back at her head, killing her. Avishai reached David in time, and Yishbi tossed David into the air and stuck a spear into the ground beneath him, so Avishai said God's secret name, and David froze midair, and then again allowing him to descend, and they escaped. Yishbi chased them, so Avishai yelled that he had killed Yishbi's mother, Yishbi became weak, and together they killed him. Besides for Avishai, there were 2 others that the ground shortened, allowing for a faster travel, which is a concept called Kvitzas Haderach. For Eliezer, Avram's servant, as he went to find a wife for Yitzchak, the wording of the verse says he left on the same day he arrived, and also for Yaakov, as he traveled from Beersheba. It cites the related verses and discusses further that many of King David's descendants were destroyed for his role in the destruction of the city of Nov, leaving his descendant Yoash as the sole survivor after the purge of Asaliah, mother of Achaziah, which is from the Book of Chronicles. It discusses further verses on Sennacherib's attacks and armies and the destruction of the attacking Assyrians, who it says were slaughtered by the angel Gabriel. Some say he did this by breathing into their nostrils, some say he simply clapped, others say he opened their ears and caused them to hear the heavenly song of the angels, and they all died. It debates who survived. It speaks on the death of Sennacherib, how angels appeared to him in disguise and offered him a haircut, so he lit a fire and started shaving his beard, and then the fire caught on his beard and he accidentally cut himself. So he went a while later and found a plank which remained from Noah's Ark and offered his sons as an offering to the plank if it protected him, but his sons overheard and they eventually killed him. It discusses some related verses on Nebuchadnezzar. It also discusses his conquest of Jerusalem and how his general Nebuzaradan slaughtered many people and children to try and calm the blood of Zechariah and eventually converted to Judaism. Such a thing occurred to a few individuals, including descendants of Sisera and Sancherib, Shmaiah and Avtalion eventually were descended from them after they converted to Judaism. And even the descendants of Haman became righteous scholars. There are further verses. On Moshiach, it said Moshiach will come in a generation when the Torah scholars decrease and the people's eyes will be worn from grief and anxiety. There will be constant trouble and harsh decrees, and before the first trouble is over, a new one will appear. It said in the 7-year cycle of Moshiach's coming, the first year will have partial famine, the second full famine, the third the death of men, women, and children, along with the righteous, and Torah knowledge will be forgotten. The fourth will be a year of partial sufficiency. The fifth will be a year of great sufficiency. There will be food and rejoicing, and Torah knowledge will return. In the 6th year, there will be sounds and heralding, and in the 7th year, war, and after Moshiach will come. It says, there have been many 7-year cycles with all of these, but never all in this order. It's also said, in the generation of Moshiach's coming, the meeting places of the sages will be used for harlotry. Galilee will be destroyed, and Gavlan will be made desolate, and the people of the borders will wander from town to town unassisted. The wisdom of scholars will decay, and those who fear sin will be hated, and truth will be absent. It gives instances of this. Youth will shame the elders, and elders will stand before the young. This is based on some verses. The face of the generation will be the face of a dog, and a son is not abashed before his father. It's also said in the generation of Mashiach, insolence will increase, honor will dwindle, things will become expensive, the kingdom will turn to heresy, and there will be no rebuke. It also says the informers will be numerous, the Torah students will be few, the people will be destitute, and similar. It said the world will exist for 6,000 years and will be destroyed for another 1,000, although others say for 2,000. Also, the first 2,000 years of the world were of nothingness, the next 2,000 were of Torah, and the next 2,000 years of Mashiach. However, it's been delayed due to our sins. There's sometimes said when Moshiach will come, there's a story where a man found an ancient scroll that said the world would exist for 4,291 years, wherein the great sea creatures would do battle, and then the wars of Gog and Magog would come, and after would be Moshiach, and then after 7,000 years the world will be renewed. Others say the scroll said after 5,000 years. However, in spite of all of this, it illustrates the folly of trying to calculate the time of Moshiach's coming, and it's a very wrong thing to do. It also says that in every generation there are 36 righteous men who receive the divine presence. It's debated if there even is a specific date for Moshiach's coming. Some say that all that's required is repentance and good deeds. It's said that if this is not done, then God will simply appoint a harsh ruler and then it will be done. There are further points on Moshiach's coming. It said that it'll only come when the economy is poor, when the arrogant are eliminated from Israel, when the judges are eliminated. It'll come through charity. It said that it'll come with a dwindling generation or an immensely troubled one. Some say Moshiach will only come in a generation that's totally virtuous or totally guilty. It's also said that Moshiach will come riding on a donkey of a sort. A story, once Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi asked Eliyahu, Elijah the prophet, by the cave of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, and asked if he'd enter the world to come. He was told, if God willed it. He then asked when Moshiach would come, so Eliyahu told him to go ask Moshiach, who is sitting at the gates of the city amongst the diseased paupers. All of them untie all their bandages at once, but Moshiach is the one untying and retying his bandages one at a time, in case Moshiach comes at any moment, so he'll be ready. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi went to meet him and asked when he was coming. Moshiach responded, today. So he met with Eliyahu, who told him he was assured a place in the world to come. He asked, Moshiach said he was coming today, but he's not here. So Eliyahu responded, saying he meant today if you heed his voice. One sage was asked when Moshiach would come, and he refused to answer in case they demanded a sign to show he was right, so his students said they wouldn't ask for a sign. So he responded, when the gate of Rome falls and is rebuilt again and then falls for the third time, that's when Moshiach will come. The students then demanded a sign, so he said the waters of a certain cave should turn to blood, and they did. But there are further points on this, including the statement that the whole world was made only for Moshiach. It's debated what Moshiach's name will be based on several verses. Some say Shiloh, some say Yinoin, others say Chanina, some say Menachem. Others say the leper of the house of Rebbe. It questions who Moshiach will be like, whether he's among the living or among the dead. It debates the length of the Messianic era from a number of opinions and about the eternal reward. Anyways, it goes back and discusses several points on the wickedness of denying the divinity of the Torah, or even of not studying Torah properly and forgetting learning. There are many further points on the importance of studying Torah and doing mitzvahs and the great negativity of being a heretic and apikairos. Some say such a person is one who denigrated the Torah scholars, others say it refers to denigrating scripture. There are other definitions of an apikairos, a heretic. Some say it's one who disrespects his teacher by calling him by his name. There are related points. We also said there was a prohibition on reading external books. Some say this means the books of heretics, possibly Sadducee heretics. Others say it's a reference to the book of Ben Sirah, and it cites many problematic passages from it and a few proper ones. It also expounds the issue with incanting over a wound and similar, which was mentioned, such as consulting demons, which is prohibited. There are further points. It also explains the prohibition on saying God's name according to its letters. This refers to saying it outside the temple and in a foreign tongue. It also expounds verses and cites teachings on the particular men it said would not merit the world to come, particularly on the wicked deeds of Yerovam. These are all discussed further, and it also brings verses on Menashe and Achav and their wrongdoings. It gives further interpretations of various passages, and there are other verses on the wickedness of Achaz, Menashe, and Ammon, on their heresy and immorality, and other scriptural figures. There are further points. It additionally expounds on many verses from the Book of Lamentations. There are further points. In regards to the specifically mentioned individuals at the beginning of the chapter who have no place in the world to come, it mentions Bilam, a non-Jewish man, thereby implying that other non-Jewish people would have such a portion. It speaks on the wickedness of the false prophet Bilam, saying he performed vile acts of sorcery and also bestiality. It said that Bilam's donkey spoke to him in the verses. It's explained that the Moabite emissaries asked why he was not on a horse, and Bilam said he typically used a horse, but he was just using the donkey at that point, at which point the donkey opened its mouth and spoke, saying, "No, I'm your sole animal," that he always used, and that also Bilam was intimate with the donkey. The verse also says that Bilam was one who knows the mind of the Supreme One, which doesn't make sense if he didn't even know what his donkey was thinking. So it explains what Bilam knew was the single instant every single day that God is angry with the Jewish people, and he sought to exploit it. The instant is during the first 3 hours of the day, at the time the comb of the rooster pales totally, with no red streaks. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi once tried to wait for this time to curse a particular heretic, but he kept sleeping through the time, so realized it was improper to do this. Balak, Bilam's partner, in attempts to curse the Jewish people, it says he offered many offerings to God, and because of this, he merited to have Rus as his descendant, which teaches that a person should always study Torah or do mitzvahs, even for the wrong reason, as he'll eventually come to do the good deeds for the right reasons. Bilam ended up blessing the Jewish people instead of cursing them, and it gives additional discussion on the verses. It explains these further. It also explains how Bilam showed the Moabite women how to lure the Jewish people to be with them and eventually worship their idols. It said that Bilam eventually died in the Battle of Midian, now only as a sorcerer. He was killed by Pinchas in battle, and it says he was executed using all 4 methods of execution at the same time. It also explains many teachings on the wickedness of Doeg, the other individual without a portion in the world to come, in spite of the fact that he and Achitophel were extremely learned. It's also said a person should never put himself in a situation where he'll be tested, as King David begged to be tested like the forefathers, and he was, even being informed that this was going to happen beforehand, but he still messed up with the whole Bathsheba incident. It said when this occurred, as King David was staring off his roof into the city, there was an object in the way of Bathsheba's window, so the Satan appeared like a bird, which King David shot an arrow at, which hit the object and exposed Bathsheba bathing, which resulted in all those issues. It said they were actually destined to marry, but he forced it too early, and he was frequently mocked as people would ask him to teach the laws on execution for adultery. The Bathsheba situation was a cause for Avshalom's rebellion. Another was that there's an interpretation of a verse that King David contemplated doing idolatry. It also explains how David begged forgiveness and suffered immensely for all this. It was known that King David was finally forgiven when King Solomon built the temple and tried to enter, as the gates remained closed up until the point that King Solomon asked that they open in the name of David, and they did, and all knew that David was forgiven. It explains the sins of Gehazi and his dealings with Elisha. It's said to never push even a sinner away with 2 hands, as Elisha did to Gehazi, and also as Yeshua ben Parachio did to Yeshu HaNitzri. This whole story was also said in Tractate Sota 47a, where I gave some necessary background, and it's additionally referenced earlier in this tractate on 43a, so check there if you're curious. With that aside, it says the story as to how he became a heretic. He had studied beneath the tutelage of Rabbi Yeshua ben Parachia for a while during the times of the king Alexander Janneus, and together they were traveling back to Jerusalem, and they stopped by an inn, at which point the sage praised the hostess in reference to her deeds, but a student criticized the compliment, thinking it was on the looks of the hostess, and saying she actually wasn't beautiful, so because of this, the sage got upset that a student was thinking about such things and had him excommunicated. The student came begging back to him many times, but Rabbi Yeshua ben Parachia always ignored him. Once the student again came to beg forgiveness, and the sage happened to be finally willing to take him back and forgive him at that exact point, but he was in the middle of prayer, so he gestured to the student to wait, but the student thought he was motioning him to leave, pushing him away, so he decided to become a heretic. He stood a brick on one end and worshipped it as an idol. Further, he began to practice forbidden sorcery, and he caused many others to sin. So when he later re-met his teacher, he refused to repent, saying it was too late for him, as he caused many others to sin in addition. So by this and others, we see the negativity of pushing people away with both hands. Anyways, it's also taught that Avraham, the forefather, didn't age, so people frequently confused him with Yitzchak, so Avraham begged to age, and from then on that became a thing that happened to people. Yaakov similarly prayed to become weaker before he passed, and that also became a concept, and Elisha recovered from his illness, and was the first person ever to have done so. New Mishnah. As the verse implies, the people of the generation of the flood have no share in the world to come, nor will they stand in judgment. The generation of the dispersion, those who built the Tower of Babel, also have no share in the world to come, and neither do the people of Sodom, although it's debated whether they'll stand in judgment. The spies of the desert have no share, and it's debated as to whether the generation of the wilderness and the congregation of Korach have a share from verses. The Gemara explains points on the generation of the flood, that they rejected God, saying they had great abundance in water and streams, so they were punished with the flood. Others say it was due to their haughtiness. It's also said 3 of the openings of the deep from the flood stayed open, which are the whirlpool of Gadol, the hot springs of Tiberias, and the great fountain of Beiram. It further speaks on the great sins of this generation, which largely involved things like bestiality and robbery. It says that Noah was a righteous man, perfect in his generation. Some say this means he was totally righteous, others say he was only considered righteous comparative to the rest of his generation, hence why it specifies in his generation. It expounds on many verses relating to the flood. There are further points on this. It says Noah first sent out a raven, who complained and argued that Noah was only sending it out as Noah wanted to cohabit with the raven's wife. Noah said that was ridiculous, as all cohabitation was banned within the ark. The dog violated this prohibition within the ark, so was condemned to be leashed. The raven did too, and was condemned to have to be fed by spitting seeds into its mate's mouth. And Noah's son, Ham, violated this prohibition, so his son Cush's skin was affected. There are related points on all this. It says that when Abraham fought the kings, he threw dust into the air and it turned to swords and arrows to strike them. Related, there was the sage who was called Nachum Ish Gamzu, because he would always say Gamzu Latova. This too is for the good. There's a famous story about this, wherein the Jewish people wanted to send a gift to the Caesar, so they asked Nachum Ish Gamzu to go, as he was accustomed to having miracles happen for him. So they filled a chest with gems and pearls and sent him with it. Along the way, he stayed at a place whose owners snuck over to the chest, emptied it, and filled it with dirt. The next day, he saw the dirt and said, "This too is for the best," and he traveled on. It was brought to the Caesar, who was very upset when he opened it, thinking the Jews were mocking him. So Nachum said again, "This too is for the best." So Elio, the prophet, appeared as a Roman official and said, "Abraham threw dirt and straw at his enemies, and it turned into swords and arrows to defeat them. So perhaps this is the same." So the Romans tested the dirt on a city that they were unable to conquer, and they used the dirt, and it worked, and they conquered the city. So as thanks, they filled up the chest with gems and pearls, and they sent it with Nachum, and they sent him away with great honor. Anyways, Nachum traveled back the same way, stayed at the same place as before, and told what had happened to his hosts, the men who had stolen from him, so they took all the dirt and brought it to the Caesar. It didn't work, and they were executed. Regarding the generation of the diaspora and the Tower of Babel, it said there were 3 reasons they built it. Some were to live up there, and those were dispersed. Some were to worship idols, those had their languages confused, and others were to wage war against God, and those were turned into spirits and demons. Others say they all did it for idolatry. As for the tower, it said the top third was burnt, a third was swallowed into the ground, and a third remains. It said the area of the tower today causes forgetfulness. It also discusses the sins of the Sodomites and their perverse, unjust laws. It discusses these and the ridiculous rulings that they would have within their city, when they would reward sin and punish good. It said that they had guest beds, that if the guest was too short, they would stretch him, and if too long, they would cut off the excess, among other crimes. Like they found this one woman giving charity, so they covered her with honey and stuck her on a wall until bees consumed her. It also discusses verses on the spies and on Korach. It brings many further teachings on Korach. Points on the generation of the wilderness also discussed. New Mishnah. Some say the 10 tribes will never return. Others say they only will once Moshiach comes. The Gemara says some say the 10 tribes don't have a place in the world to come. Others say they only do if they repent. Others say they do. Some say a child has a place in the world to come the moment he's born. Others say it's from when he speaks. Others say it's from when he's circumcised. Others say it's from when he says the word Amen. It discusses many other verses. These are discussed. New Mishnah. The inhabitants of a city subverted to idolatry have no share in the world to come. The liability of beheading for the inhabitants of the city only applies if the city was subverted by its own inhabitants from the same tribe towards the majority of the city, and subverted by men. Also, every member of the city must have his own 2 witnesses and a warning. Individuals who do idolatry had stoning, and their property was left alone. A subverted city would have beheading, and their property was destroyed. A passing caravan can count as part of the city to prevent it from being destroyed by being a part of the non-idol worshipping majority. The possessions of everybody, idol worshipping and otherwise, within the actual city are destroyed. Only the idolatrous possessions outside the city are destroyed. Everything is gathered into the square. If there is none, they make a square. Anything consecrated is redeemed, any teruma tithes are left to rot, and mais or sheni tithes and books of scripture are hidden or buried. The destruction of such a city is regarded as a burnt olah offering. The remains of the city cannot even be made into gardens or orchards. Others say it can, it just means there's no structures. So long as there is wickedness in the world, so is God's anger. If there is none, God's anger disappears. The Gemara qualifies particularities regarding the accounting of tribes. It's debated if the city can be divided between 2 of the tribes. It debates as to the status of the city subverted itself. Whether majority is idolatrous would be assessed by imprisoning and judging them all, stoning each individual that's found to be an idol worshipper until they reach the majority. Some say they set up multiple courts. It debates the status of various unique forms of property from the city. These principles are discussed further. It quotes many related verses on the destruction of Jericho and on the drought brought about by Eliyahu after Ahab's blasphemy. The drought only ended once Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, wanted to resurrect the child of the widow in Seraphis, as there are 3 keys: the key of childbirth, the key of rain, and the key of resurrection. Eliyahu had been using the key of rain, but he could only have one at a time, so he traded it for the key of resurrection, and therefore the drought ended. The wicked in the world, as referenced that anger God, refers to thieves. It cites some related verses, and that's the end of chapter 11 and the entire Tractate Sanhedrin. Alright, that was a lot of information, so here's a rough summary of a lot of the practical takeaways from this tractate. There are 3 types of courts: a regular court called a Beis Din, a lesser Sanhedrin, and a greater Sanhedrin. A typical Beis Din, a regular court, is presided over by 3 qualified judges who rule on monetary disputes and similar. A lesser and greater Sanhedrin no longer exist, as they only exist when the temple does. When they did, they judged cases of capital punishment and more severe rulings. A lesser Sanhedrin had 23 judges and a greater Sanhedrin had 71. When capital punishment was done in the times of the temple, there were 4 main forms of execution. Depending on the severity of the transgression, a person could be sentenced to stoning, burning, beheading, or strangulation. The 7 Noahide laws are 7 laws that apply to all people. Originally, they were enforced like all Jewish laws. Now, without a Sanhedrin, they essentially act as moral guidelines encouraged towards the rest of the world. They consist of: do not worship idols, do not blaspheme, do not murder, do not steal, do not cohabit immorally, do not eat the severed limb of an animal, meaning to be kind to them, and to establish courts of justice. Additionally, it said that while a Jewish person needs to abide by all 613 laws of the Torah to be proper, if a non-Jewish person abides by the 7, he is righteous and goes straight to heaven alongside everybody else. Moshiach and the resurrection of the dead are fundamental beliefs in the Jewish religion. May we merit to see it soon, speedily, in our days. And that's about everything. Thank you so much for watching.